Hello folks on the stream. Before we go on the air, I usually leave a few minutes grace before we switch on the transmitter. Tonight, the early history of the telephone, and I hope this will be, in many cases, new material to the people watching the stream. We've managed to find recordings of many of the people who are involved with the invention of the telephone. Surprisingly, they do survive, even though the invention dates from the mid-1870s, nearly 150 years ago. But anyway, I don't think we've got any dropped frames, and I'll just check to see that we've got a stream up. I think we have. So we go on the air. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima from Burwood East with the usual Saturday night test transmission. On this occasion, we'll be spending an evening with the inventors of the telephone, having dealt with valve technology. Let's go back even further to the 1870s and 80s, when the idea of audio electronics was first devised. In fact, this was the birth of audio as we know it. I have a few interesting artifacts in my collection, but perhaps the most interesting artifact and the most valuable that I have is this book. I'm holding it up to the webcam, and if people want to have a look in on this transmission, please Google VK3AML 3 September 2022. That's Google the phrase VK3AML 3 September 2022. What I have in my hand is a book called Speaking Telephone and Electric Light and Other Recent Electrical Inventions. I'll hold up the title page. It was published by Appleton and Company in New York, would you believe, in 1879. It's one of the oldest books on electronics that I possess. I think I have an older book on the telegraph from the 1860s, but doesn't quite cover this area. And the author of this book was George B. Prescott, a very interesting character, born 1830. Now in here, you'll see that top illustration I'm holding up is of one of the first, what we would now call a microphone, devised by Alexander Graham Bell. What people don't realise is that one of these, made by Graham Bell's assistant Thomas Augustus Watson, who you'll actually hear a recording of tonight, one of that very type of microphone is in Melbourne. It's at the Melbourne Science Museum, and the way it got there was extremely interesting. There was a relative of Alexander Graham Bell's in the colonial treasury. And in Prescott's book also we can find a page from the original patent application for the telephone dated March 7th, 1876. That's a jolly long time ago. So the recordings that we've located of people involved with the birth of the telephone are actually very old indeed. So let's go over to our stream. This is George B. Prescott, the author of the book that you've just seen, born 1830, died 1894. And here we see the telephone, the Bell telephone from 1876 that survives in the Museum of Victoria, not currently on display but certainly in storage. It was actually fabricated by Bell's assistant Thomas Watson. The situation with this is that Alexander Graham Bell had an uncle whose name was E.S. Symonds, S-Y-M-O-N-D-S, who just happened to be an American expatriate in Australia, in Melbourne in fact, who was Under Secretary to the colony of Victoria. And he happened to visit his family, the Bells, in Brantford, Ontario, in Canada, one of the Bell residences. And Alexander Graham Bell had this telephone. It was wound to an impedance of 10 ohms, which meant that it was usable on short lines with low loss, but where you had high losses, a higher impedance phone would work better. And so, rather than retain this, he gave it to his uncle, who brought it back to Australia. I've actually handled this very piece of apparatus as close to the absolute invention of the telephone as you can get, and that's one of Thomas Watson's receivers that you'd push against your ear to hear the telephone message. That little reed, that metal reed pushed against your ear would allow you to hear it. And it's one of those receivers that was used to receive the very first telephone sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." So there's Alexander Graham Bell as he was at the time of the invention of the telephone. Originally a Scot, had moved to America in 1870. There he is in a recreation with Thomas Watson. Thomas Watson, his assistant, an engineer of not inconsiderable ability, seen there in 1877, did most of the fabrication of these phones for him. And in 1913, Watson, of course, by that stage had quite a reputation for being involved with the start of the telephone. In 1913, he published a book called The Birth and Babyhood of the Telephone, and Thomas Edison, just at that time, was devising a system for recording talking pictures. Didn't succeed, but he did invite Thomas Watson to his studio to record his recollections of the invention of the telephone on this equipment. Now, this is the Bronx studio of the Edison Company, and you'll see up on a stand on the right there's a phonograph, a recording phonograph with a recording horn that's actually collecting sound from the stage. The stage felt covered, oversized cylinders used for the recording of the sound. And if you look on the floor there, you'll see two cords which actually are sight lines. You'll see the cords there. I'll outline them. They're sight lines to indicate to the person on camera where the edges of the camera field are. There's the camera from a slightly different angle on that table, driven by batteries, and the phonograph up the top there you can see on the top left. And with this, he recorded Thomas Watson doing his talk on the birth of the telephone in 1913. This is a typical kinetophone record that you're seeing on the screen at the moment. They released these films with great ballyhoo about 1911, 12, 13, but they had problems with synchronization and with fidelity. So it never actually made commercial success of it at that stage, but these were among the first talking pictures. And here's Thomas Watson to talk about...
Ladies and gentlemen, I first met Alexander Graham Bell in 1874. He came to the shop where I was working to have his Harmonic Telegraph constructed. This work was assigned to me. The object of this invention was the transmission of several telegraph messages over one wire at the same time, utilizing the fact that a tuned reed will vibrate when its own note is sounded near it. This is a receiver of Bell's telegraph with its magnet and steel reed. The transmitter had in addition contact points, which, when its reed vibrated, would send corresponding electric impulses through the distant receiver. If that receiver's reed was tuned to the pitch of these pulsations, it would respond. I made for Bell 6 transmitters with reeds of 6 different pitches, and 6 receivers with their reeds tune to correspond. But the apparatus did not work very well. Bell was obliged constantly to retune the receiver reed. When doing this, he had the habit of putting the receiver against his ear. This led to a most important discovery. During the months that we were experimenting on his telegraph, Bell often spoke to me of another invention he was struggling with. It was the telephone. I remember my surprise when he first told me he expected soon to be able to talk by telegraph. He explained to me his wonderful idea of an electric current which would copy the vibrations of speech, and described a complex telephone he had devised. It was never constructed as it was too expensive. June 2nd, 1875 is the most important day in the history of the telephone. For on that day, Bell got a glimpse that showed him the road leading to the realization of his speaking telephone idea. That afternoon, his harmonic telegraph was working worse than ever. One of the steel reeds in my room stopped vibrating. I snapped it several times to start it when Bell came rushing from the other room in great excitement. He told me that he had heard in the receiver at his ear the actual sound of the spring I had snapped. It was the first real sound that had ever been transmitted to a human ear by electricity, and he was sure that the same mechanism could also transmit speech. That very afternoon, Bell gave me directions for making the first speaking telephone. Here is an exact duplicate of it. It has one of the telegraph receivers set in a frame with the free end of its reed attached to the center of a drumhead and a mouthpiece to talk into. Bell's idea was to force the reed to follow the voice vibrations instead of merely swinging to and fro. I made 2 of these telephones the next day, and we tested them on the evening of June 3rd, 1875. I could hear the sound of Mr. Bell's voice and could almost understand some of his words. But my voice was not then strong enough to make him hear a sound. He was disappointed, but was sure he was on the right track. Many experiments on the telephone followed during the next 2 years. Here are a few of the many telephones I made for Bell during that period. On March 10th, 1876, the telephone transmitted its first complete sentence. "Mr. Watson, please come here. I want you." On October 9th, 1876, the first conversation over a real wire was carried on by Mr. Bell and myself. The wire was 2 miles long, running from Boston to Cambridge. The telephone was ready for public use in the spring of 1877, 2 years after the first telephone was made. This is one of the first telephones ever put into commercial use.
And that film was recorded in 1913. The film itself doesn't survive, but the soundtrack on an oversized cylinder made by Edison certainly does, as you have heard. Getting back to Alexander Graham Bell, does any recording of his voice exist? And the answer until about 10 years ago was no. No playable recording. But there were some very fragile wax recording tests made by Graham Bell after the invention of the telephone in the early 1880s, surviving in the Smithsonian Institution. They're not tremendously clear, but these are the only recordings of Graham Bell's voice that survive. 1885. Graham Bell again in the 1870s. A transcript is on the video if you have trouble.
This record has been made by Alexander Graham Bell in the presence of Dr. Christopher A. Bell on the 16th of April, 1885, at the Balkan Laboratory, 1241 Pacific Avenue, Washington, D.C., in Whitney, Florida, near my house.
Alexander
Graham Bell.
There is more to that, but they were recorded, played back optically with no contact with the recording. Now, Thomas Watson, Alexander Graham Bell's assistant, survived into the early 1930s, and in 1926, for an engineering exhibition, he was recorded with sound on disc, the Vitaphone process, and this is the surviving part of that film, 1926, again Thomas Watson, this time electrically recorded. The first instruments designed by Alexander Graham Bell to carry speech by wire were built for him by Thomas A. Watson, then a young mechanic in Boston. 50 years later, Mr. Watson himself tells the story of these epoch-making experiments.
June 2nd, 1875 is a most important day in the annals of the telephone, for on that day, guided by the light of his own wonderful theory, Bell found the road leading to the realization of his speaking telephone idea. On that afternoon, his harmonic telegraph was working worse than usual. One of the steel reeds in my room stopped vibrating, and as I snapped it several times to start it going thus, Bell came rushing from the other room in great excitement and told me he had heard in the instrument at his ear the actual sound of the spring I had snapped. It was the first real sound that had ever been transmitted to the human ear by electricity, and Bell was sure that the same mechanism could also transmit speech. After successfully repeating the experiment by vibrating over a magnet all the different steel springs we could find, Bell sketched for me before we parted that same night the first electric speaking telephone, beseeching me to have it ready to try the next evening if possible. Following his directions, I constructed the first speaking telephone and had it ready for trial on the evening of the next day, June 3rd, 1875. Here is an exact duplicate of that first telephone. It has one of the telegraph receiving instruments set in a frame with the free end of the reed attached to the center of a drumhead and an opening to talk into. Bell's idea was to force the reed to follow the voice vibrations instead of merely swinging to and fro. When we tried it, I could hear the sound of Bell's voice and could almost understand some of his words. But my voice was not then strong enough to make him hear a sound. He was disappointed, but was sure he was on the right track. Although many experiments on the telephone immediately followed, it was not until March 10, 1876, that the telephone transmitted its first complete sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you."
Good afternoon, Mr. Watson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Watson.
There it is. That is, I think, just as you wanted me to make it.
Yes, that is right. Diaphragm, platinum rod, cup, glue for regulating the immersion. That is all right. Now to connect it in. this ought to bring us a step nearer our goal. But if it is a failure, we shall nonetheless have advanced a step. We shall know that it is not right. But I am confident this will prove to be a little better than anything we have done before.
We are ready.
Well, here is the receiver, now to test it. Mr. Watson, come here. I want you.
Mr. Bell, I heard every word you said. Distinct.
What? Every word?
Yes, sir, I heard every word.
That is splendid. Now you sit down and do the speaking. And
That
let
is
me hear.
bad acting.
How do you do, Mr. Bell? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mr. Bell?
It is better than I had dared to hope. Yes, I heard every word. I could recognize even the quality of your voice. It is a practical thing at last. It will be a success, Mr. Watson, beyond any question.
3 months later, in June 1876, Mr. Bell exhibited his telephone at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, seeking public recognition for the invention. The judges were about to adjourn without examining Mr. Bell's exhibit when Dom Pedro, Emperor of Brazil, who accompanied them, recognised the inventor from a former meeting in Boston.
Professor Bell, I am delighted to see you again. And how are the deaf mutes of Boston?
Very well, I thank you, Your Majesty. And my exhibit was to have been the next thing on the program.
What? Have you invented something?
Yes.
Is it?
An apparatus for talking over a telegraph wire.
Well, then, we must see that without fail. Where is it?
Wait, Your Majesty. It is up this way. There, Your Majesty. Will you please hold this up to your ear? Hold it perfectly straight, up and down. No, like this. There, that is right. And I shall go to the other end of this wire and talk to you. I shall use another instrument exactly like this one.
You want me to keep this to my ear? Like this?
Yes, Your Majesty, and I will talk to you. I will recite for you some lines from Shakespeare's Hamlet.
It talks. It does talk.
It is remarkable.
Wonderful. I congratulate you most heartily. This invention of yours, Mr. Bell, will bring the conscience of the world nearer to each other.
What yesterday I should have declared impossible, I have today seen realized. It is the most wonderful thing I've seen in America.
It is the greatest marvel achieved by the telegraph. I remember your telling me about your ideas in Washington, not much more than a year ago.
I can't tell you how much you encouraged me at that time, Professor Henry. When I said I had not the electrical knowledge necessary to overcome the difficulties in my path, you told me to get it. Those 2 words gave me the determination to go ahead.
What you say is the greatest reward the scientist can have. This invention is yet in its infancy and is susceptible of great improvement. It has a great future.
The signal recognition turned the tide. The success that followed is a familiar story. The telephone art was steadily developed, and in 1915 the Transcontinental line was opened, with Dr. Bell in New York and Mr. Watson in San Francisco to dedicate it. Mr. Watson concludes the narrative.
On that day, though separated by the continent, Bell and I talked to each other. I recognized the familiar tones of his voice and understood without difficulty every word he said. Then, using a reproduction of the first telephone, he again sent me the words of that now historic first sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Here is the wire through which 50 years ago came this first message to me from Dr. Bell. It is a priceless relic, for it is the first telephone line. During the ceremonies of the dedication in 1915, it was made a part of the great transcontinental circuit, so that after many years, it again carried to me the thrill of that first message. Then my mind went back to the memorable 10th of March, 1876, when I heard Bell speak this first sentence ever transmitted by electricity. Now, I heard these first words again, and fate decreed they should be the last he ever spoke to me. Alexander Graham Bell has passed away, but his successors shall carry forward to still greater triumphs the work that he began, and as long as man exists, the art which Bell created shall endure.
Thomas Watson in 1926. And in the middle of this photograph you actually see Watson with the receiver at his ear in San Francisco at the Panama-Pacific Exposition, the exhibit run by the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, the Bell system. And there he is receiving the first phone call, transcontinental phone call, January 1915, along with various other panjandrums of San Francisco. I think that's the mayor of San Francisco to the right there. Thomas Augustus Watson, Alexander Graham Bell's assistant. Moving right along, hopefully. Watson died in 1934, but lived long enough to become the grand old man of telephone engineering. That's him in the middle of the group there. And now a documentary on the development of the telephone made by AT&T, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, in 1932. And this was made at a time when all of the stages of the development of the telephone were within living memory. Using the original equipment, they recreated the early experiments, unfortunately with the same sort of acting ability or lack of ability that you've just seen. Switchboards Old and New, 1932.
There it is. Millions of times a day in America. Someone has a message for someone else. A signal is flashed, it's answered. A highway for quick private travel is needed. The routes are selected, joined together, and then the intricate and sensitive apparatus for all this has had a most romantic history of development. Switching the voice from one line to another was first tried over the wires of a burglar alarm system in Boston in May 1877, a little more than a year after the telephone had transmitted the first complete sentence. The manager of this system put telephone instruments in the offices of 5 of his customers for a few days and connected one with another through switches in his own office. It was over a year after Alexander Graham Bell had begun to demonstrate his invention that there was a commercial telephone switchboard. It was put in service in New Haven, Connecticut on January 28, 1878. Here is a model of it. It had 8 lines with a total of 21 subscribers, so the operator wasn't very busy. What do you want? Hitching City Market? What's your name? Oh, all right, Dr. Burwell. Just a minute. Hello? Hello? City Market? Someone wants to talk to you. Wait a minute. All right, Dr. Burwell. Here's Hitchings Market. Go ahead. And as yet, there was not any voice with a smile, as this New York switchboard 1879 model makes clear. Very clear. Here's the way it was operated. History tells us that subscribers had difficulty in getting connections. The history is probably right about it. Now, for the sake of contrast, let's glance at an operating room of today. This is an unusual picture because few operating rooms are long enough for a switchboard of this size to be built without curves or angles. It can serve as many as 10,500 lines.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Some peculiar switching devices made their appearance during the first few years of switchboard development. This one, for example, could accommodate only a small number of lines, but it was the first to introduce the key shelf, which had such an important development, and the cord circuit. Sections could be installed side by side and take care of 200 or 300 lines. But as telephone central offices increased in size, this method became difficult and awkward and was generally unsatisfactory until the invention in 1882 of the multiple switchboard. The thought underlying the multiple switchboard was that an operator must be able to connect any one of the particular group of lines she answered with any other line on the entire switchboard. That meant that terminals for every line had to appear somewhere within the reach of every operator. These terminals, which were small circular openings on the switchboard, were called jacks. For example, terminal jacks for line 1, 2, 3, 4 appeared a number of times on the switchboard, but all of them were connected together. And any operator at the entire switchboard could establish a connection to line 1, 2, 3, 4. A splendid idea. But how was an operator to know whether or not a line she wished to connect to was busy? Perhaps an operator at another part of the switchboard had already established a connection to the line. A quick and accurate means was devised whereby the operator, before plugging in, touched the tip of her plug to the rim of the jack. If a sharp click was produced in her receiver, it meant that the line was busy. If no click was heard, it meant that the line was not in use and she could establish the connection. Another very important milestone in switchboard progress was the introduction of the common battery system. This enabled one large storage battery in the central office to supply the current for talking, replacing the individual batteries on the subscriber's premises. Of course, local conditions determine when a common battery can be used economically. For a scattered population where switchboards are smaller in size, talking current is supplied by dry batteries installed with each telephone. Hand generators are used to signal the operator, and drop signals instead of electric lights serve to attract her attention. This type of switchboard is known as a magneto board. From successive improvements, the switchboard of today was evolved. Here it is, the A board, or answering board, in a large central office. Notice the orderly but complex system of wiring under the key shelf. Your telephone line terminates in a jack and lamp. When you remove the receiver, the lamp lights instantly, and your call is answered by one of the operators before whom the light appears. By this arrangement, there's always an operator ready to take your call. Usually, the operator at the A board passes the call to another type of board for completion. It's known to telephone people as the B board or completing board. You'll notice that the face of this board is full of the openings called jacks, but there are no accompanying lamp signals. For every 2 or 3 operators at a B board, there's one of these jacks associated with your telephone. This type of multiple arrangement was developed directly from that first used in 1882. If your line is not busy, the operator inserts the plug in the jack, and the ringing starts automatically. You'll usually find that special private switchboards are used in business offices. There are many types and sizes. Some serve a few telephones in a small office. Others are designed to interconnect hundreds of telephones in a large organization. One of the largest of these private switchboards is in a New York hotel. 24 operators can sit at this switchboard, which utilizes 139 trunk lines to telephone central offices and serves over 3,000 telephones within the hotel. If you ever visit a toll, a long-distance operating room, here's another type of switchboard that you will see. Now, these are also multiple switchboards, so that direct lines to many out-of-town points are within immediate reach of every operator. In a dial office, the switching equipment automatically gives you the number dialed, or else reports that it's busy. There is, however, a switchboard with operators in every dial office. Here is one. If you call a number that's been changed or disconnected, for example, your call is automatically routed to one of these operators. Or if you dial operator, one of them will answer you. If you dial operator in an emergency and call for the fire department or the police department or for an ambulance, one of these operators will not only complete your call, but will supervise it personally until your message has been transmitted. An exceedingly interesting apparatus is known as the call distributing B board, which is used when calls for dial telephones are received from non-dial telephones. In completing the call, the operator depresses numbered keys that correspond to the number wanted. An entirely different method had to be developed for completing calls when the situation is reversed. That is, when a dial subscriber wants to reach a non-dial subscriber. The number that was dialed appears in illuminated figures before the operator in the manual office, who then completes the call. Here is one of the latest and most unusual developments, a teletypewriter switchboard, where connections are made so that written messages can pass back and forth between teletypewriters, just as conversations flow between telephones. At this board, however, there's no spoken number, please. Teletypewriter users communicate with the operator in writing, the desired number appearing before her on a tape, and she communicates with other teletypewriter switchboards in the same way. The written word, not the spoken word, is what passes over the wires. 50 years have made a vast difference in the mechanisms for switching one telephone line to another. And the operating rooms have reflected many other changes, too. For millions of young women have sat before the nation's switchboards, as 200,000 sit before them today. The Telephone Family Album has preserved for us the changing mode in operators' equipment and in operators' adornment as well. It is a changing America that these portraits reflect. But though the fashions in both equipment and adornment have changed with the years, there's one fashion that has not changed, a fashion of loyalty that has marked these public servants ever since switchboards became their charge. The spirit that has become a tradition, that has been supremely demonstrated so very many times, that women have in the fullest measure. Surely these weavers of speech are part of the pageant of America's history. You will recognize the newest portrait in the album, for it is a speaking likeness.
Number, please. Thank you.
A composite likeness of the hundreds of thousands, alert, devoted, true, who serve us all at the switchboards of the nation.
Number, please.
And this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. You're watching a program of documentary material, instructional material, related to the early history of the telephone And in connection with that, what I'm about to show is a dramatised documentary of the way that America coped with the construction of the Transcontinental telephone line, the first one of which was installed in January 1915, long after the first telegraph communication across the nation. And the way it happened was quite complex, best told by this dramatised documentary. 1915 and the lead up to it. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.
The service.
You?
While we're running through the opening to this film, please, if you want to see the film, look for VK3AML 3 September 2022
repositories in New York City
on
that
Google.
Reveal in fascinating detail the application of the telephone principle to the service of mankind. In one on Lower Broadway are preserved the records that tell the entire story of the effort to introduce and carry on the service of intercommunication by the spoken word. Here are the reports and correspondence of the pioneers whose work and faith were the foundations of today's great industry. Here are the records that disclose the early vision of a unified system and of universal service, and that mark the progress toward that ideal. Here, among the memories of an industry's birth, are the early directories with about a few dozen names to illustrate the slow but growing acceptance of the telephone's aid to living. And here are two treasured relics of appealing significance to the men and women of the Bell system who come like pilgrims to this eloquent room. One is the grant issued on March the 7th, 1876, proclaiming Alexander Graham Bell to be the inventor of the medium of communication we call the telephone, though it was then officially designated as an improvement in telegraphy. The other is a notebook of Bell's assistant, Thomas Watson, with its casually penciled record of the first complete sentence that human ear ever heard over a wire. Bell's sudden call on March the 10th, 1876. Mr. Watson, come here, I want you. What an amazing circumstance it is that the first of all telephone calls should have been, I want you, as though to signify the reason for all the calls to follow. In the other repository on West Street are exhibits of corresponding significance. It is a museum that reveals the development of the telephone art as expressed in apparatus. To begin this physical record of scientific accomplishment are the harmonic telegraph instruments of Bell's early experiments and the other instruments that followed before the telephone itself emerged from its first laboratory. You may see here a coil of the actual wire over which passed those historic words, I want you. There is the great company of telephones which progressively represent the improving standards of service. There are switchboards at which sat the friendly operators of another day. Preserved here and appropriately labeled are historic transmitters through which speech first rode the radio waves across the seas, and others with which presidents have talked with the heads of many nations in dedicating new telephonic links to distant lands. Here are sections of cable to mark the development that brought about today's technical and manufacturing triumphs with their amazing capacity for circuits. From a few dozen wires to thousands is the progress that this dated sequence tells. Here, too, is another historical sequence of exhibits to illustrate a story of intense interest to every student of telephone accomplishment. The story of the search for amplifying devices that would help to send intelligible speech over longer and longer spans of wire. And here are portraits of men, scientists and engineers of yesterday and of today, whose names are written large on the honor roll of communications development. Visitors from all parts of the world have viewed these reminders of the treasure hunt for knowledge from which might come at the builder's hands the agency of service that now is in your charge. Mutely, they tell of the effort to meet a challenge, the challenge of social need. Such a story can only be outlined here with now and then a scene to suggest the problems faced. As a preface, let us mark an announcement of 1877, the first published offering of instruments for wire conversation, but only for distances up to 20 miles. And now, let us reconstruct from the record an incident of 1880, remembering that the date is only 2 years after the first commercial switchboard began the service of intercommunication. The scene is a building on Washington Street in Boston.
Hello? What number do you want? All right, I'll connect you. Connect number 88 brother.
Come in.
Hello? Number 76.
This is the telephone office, isn't it?
Sure. All the telephone talk goes right through this room.
My. Well, then perhaps you can help me. You see, I have no telephone. It's mostly the business people who have. That's why I'm here. And I want to talk with my son about his father.
All right. I guess we can fix it for you. The telephone's right here. Where is he?
He's in Chicago.
Chicago?
Oh, but he's a contractor now, and he's doing very well. I'm quite sure he has a telephone. I just must talk with him.
You want to talk to him on a wire?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Did you hear that, John? Here's a lady who wants to talk to Chicago.
Oh, I'm sorry, madam. There are no wires to Chicago. We have a wire to Salem, that's 15 miles, and one to Lowell, that's 25 miles. But you can't hear over them very well. They're always noisy. We have to telegraph messages over them most of the time. The longest wire is to Worcester, that's 40 miles, but it's no good for talking.
But I don't understand. I saw all the wires on the roof, and I thought they went many places. And I did so want to talk with my son.
I wish you could. You can. Someday. I'm sure you can someday. But this is a new business. No one knows much about it yet.
Oh, dear, I thought if I came here, and there are no wires, what will I do?
Hadn't you better telegraph? That's mighty quick.
Oh, yes, I know it's quick, but it's not the same thing. Oh, I did so want to hear my son's voice, and I wanted to tell him something myself, and I wanted to hear his answer myself. Well, thank you, young gentleman. Thank you.
We're sorry we can't help you. I hope it's not bad news.
Oh, no?
Well, someday there'll be a wire, a quiet wire, and then you can talk with each other.
I hope so.
I'm very sorry we can't help you now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
What was the use of all that stuff about a wire to Chicago? You must have lost some of your buttons, John Carty. That's what I think.
It's going to come someday, Harry. Something tells me it's coming. It has to come.
Why does it have to come? We're busy enough now, with the Boston folk wanting express companies and banks and wholesale houses. Who wants to talk to Chicago? That's 1,000 miles.
Who wants to talk to Chicago? That lady does. She expected to. You know, Boston banks would talk to Chicago banks if they could. And Chicago people would talk to Boston people. There'll be a wire someday because it's needed. And to other cities just as far away. Something tells me.
Ha! Something tells you. It's one of the little folk who's been whispering to you.
It's coming, Harry. It's got to come. We're going to talk to Chicago and farther yet. It's all in Mr. Bell's discovery. That's complete. It's a principle. Someone will find out how to use it better. Something tells me. Something tells me.
And now, starting with this glimpse of a period still within the memory of millions of Americans, let us dip into the record that tells of one of the great technological romances of all time. The telephone art had yet to be developed. electrical engineering was not yet a course of study in American colleges. There were only about 200 communities where a primitive service had been introduced to a doubting public. In all America, there were fewer telephones than you will find today in 7 or 8 New York office buildings. A telephone circuit was part wire and part earth, with the speech it carried, of course, at the mercy of any electrical disturbance in earth or air. A thunderstorm would completely prevent conversation. Not for many months was it discovered that an all-metal circuit would result in clearer speech. It was truly a daring experiment that was completed in 1884, a 2-wire circuit for speech between Boston and New York. But it led to an historic decision.
Yes. Oh, as soon as possible, Mr. Cahill. Oh, yes, they're all here and waiting for you. Very well, thank you. Mr. Cahill will be here in a few minutes with the certificate of incorporation, ready for our signatures.
This draft of it seems all right to me.
And to me. Well, it certainly takes in a lot of territory.
How do you mean?
This section here. It says that our lines will connect one or more points in each and every city, town, or place in the state of New York with one or more points in each and every other city, town, or place in said state, and in each and every other of the United States.
Yes, it's pretty inclusive, but then Vail's been talking about a vast system for years.
With his ideas, he's certainly the man to be the new company's first president. This language makes me smile when I think of the trouble my company has had right here in New York City trying to get subscribers.
It is rather optimistic language. Of course, some of these electrical experts are mighty skeptical. I've been looking for a certain editorial in the electrical world. Oh, here it is. It is probable that in the near future, business communications by telephone between cities separated by hundreds of miles will be an everyday occurrence. But it will be a luxury for the few, bearing the same relation to telegraphy in general that traveling in Pullman cars does to ordinary railroad travel.
That may be the way it looks now. But the line to Boston is being used by all sorts of people, even though it isn't very good. We'll find ways of making the service popular.
Well, let's hope the next line down to Philadelphia will work better. A lot of my New York subscribers say they need it.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning, J.L.
Sorry I kept you waiting.
That's perfectly all right, my boy.
Well, I've got the final draft.
Have any changes been made, Mr. Cahill?
Only one. Now, if you gentlemen will turn to page 3, where it says, in each and every other city, town, or place in said state, and in each and every other of the United States, and in Canada and Mexico, got it? This is to be added. And each and every of said cities, towns, and places is to be connected with each and every other city, town, or place in said states and countries, and also by cable, and other appropriate means with the rest of the known world.
The rest of the known world? Sacred codfish.
Well, why not? 10 years ago, you couldn't talk by wire at all.
It's a legal precaution, gentlemen. Mr. Forbes and Mr. Vail feel the new company should not be limited in its future activities. Whatever can be done, they want the company prepared to do.
The rest of the known world, eh? Well, gentlemen, we're certainly starting from scratch.
Will you sign first, Mr. Hall?
Gladly.
Sign your name on the top line, please.
So it was that in February 1885, there came into existence the organization you call the AT&T Company, founded in the infancy of the telephone to pioneer long-distance service, but destined 15 years later to become the central company of your system. While transmitters, receivers, and switching devices were being improved, an important development came from the study and introduction of the principle of transposition. The application of this interesting principle involved shifting the current path by interchanging the position of the two wires of the circuit. This exchange of the pin position of the two wires at carefully determined intervals helps to reduce the interference brought to the circuit by induction from parallel electrical currents. The part that accuracy of transposition is playing in the modern art of transmission is evident to any expert eye that scans the complex wire facilities of today. Thus, with all wire circuits, the transposition principle, an organized laboratory investigation for every department of telephone activity, there was encouragement to the effort to link together the growing telephone organizations. Yet, when wires were made to talk 1,000 miles in 1892, the accomplishment only emphasized the character of obstacles still to be overcome.
Come in.
Good morning, sir. I'd like some information about your service.
Sit down, sir.
Thank you.
What would you like to know?
Well, this new service to Chicago is going to be very useful to us. Our agents there think so, too. We usually can understand each other fairly well if we speak carefully and not too loud. But how about the Far West? We have important agents on the Pacific coast. When can we telephone to them?
I'm afraid that's something nobody knows.
But surely you're going to put up more wires.
Of course. But 1,000 miles is about the limit for talking.
But, sir, I don't understand. A wire is a wire. We can telegraph to the Pacific coast.
Yes, a wire is a wire. But a telephone circuit and a telegraph circuit are entirely different things. Let me explain it to you very simply. Here's your telephone transmitter. Here's a receiver. Here is the battery that furnishes the electrical current. Here's a wire circuit. This is you about to talk.
Very good. That does look like me.
When you talk, your transmitter diaphragm vibrates correspondingly. This produces electric waves on the wire which conform to the vibrations your voice has caused. The electric current makes the receiver diaphragm vibrate. These vibrations are similar to those of the transmitter diaphragm. They are reconverted into sound. And that's what the man at the receiver hears.
I understand all that. It seems very simple. But if the electric waves reach Chicago, why not San Francisco?
They will, but the speech would not be intelligible. You see, the electric waves which represent your voice grow weak with distance. Then they get smothered by the other waves on the wire.
What other waves?
Oh, electrical disturbances and other things. We call it noise. When your speech level gets down to the noise level, the man at the other end of the wire won't hear it.
So that's it.
That's the situation. What we need is a device that will take the electric current when it becomes weak, restore it to its original strength, and keep unchanged the wave pattern that represents your speech.
Sounds like a fine idea.
Oh, we have the idea, but we haven't found the device. When we do, we'll have better lines. The only alternative is to increase the size of the wires and space them farther apart.
Well, why not do that?
Here's the kind of wire used on the new circuit to Chicago. What we call the number 8 size. This means 870 pounds of copper to the mile. The two wires must be spaced about 12 inches apart. At certain intervals, they are transposed.
Transposed?
Yes. That helps to overcome induction.
Induction?
That's what causes the noise I was telling you about. Now, we could string wires all the way across the country, but they'd have to be larger than these number 8s, and with wider spacing. Probably, 24-inch spacing would do the job.
Well, if you can do it, I think you should do it. I want to use those wires.
It's a matter of economics, sir. A circuit like that would need thousands of pounds of copper per mile.
To support the added weight, more poles would be needed, or else heavier ones. With a wider spacing, fewer wires could be carried on the cross arms. The investment would be tremendous, so you can imagine what the rate would be. Maybe $100. Would you want to pay that?
No, of course not. Still, at times, it might be worth more than $100.
Well, there's the fundamental problem. To make wires talk, and to make it worth your while to use them.
I see. Well, I guess you fellows know what you're doing. I saw Mr. Bell's invention at the Centennial in '76. You've gone a long way since then. I suppose I should be grateful for what we have. Well, thank you very much. Goodbye, sir.
Goodbye. I hope you'll recommend the service to your friends.
I'm doing that all the while. I suppose someday you'll have a lot of wires to Chicago and pack them in one of those cables I see around town.
No cable to Chicago, I'm afraid. You can talk through cables less than 100 miles. Guess we'll stick to these number 8s up on poles where we can watch them.
Good day, sir.
Goodbye.
No cable to Chicago, thought the engineers of 1892. There was no scientific experience that could foresee it. But there is such a cable, and in the picture record of its completion is the presence of some of those same engineers watching the ceremony of the final splice. And this cable, as we heard foretold a moment ago, is packed with wire circuits, so that the pulsing, interrelated life of great urban communities may be expressed in speech over the miles. In the record, too, is a still more significant reminder of progress. A type of cable with only 4 conductors providing channels for hundreds of simultaneous conversations. And while glancing at these exhibits of development, let us mark still another achievement. It is the grouping in a single sheathing of 4,242 strands of insulated wire that may be buried so confidently beneath the city's streets as channels for the speech of its citizens. Certainly, an exciting transmission problem, that of making cable circuits conform to the needs of changing times. Yet its intriguing history is but one of 1,000 chapters in the telephone story, each replete with the thrills of discovery, of technical application, of development and change to match progress in 1,000 directions. It is a record that reveals the astonishing ramifications of scientific persistency. There's a half-century of history for you installers to read if you would know about the 100 and more types of transmitters and receivers preceding the instruments that today you put to work so skillfully. And you with switching mechanisms in your care. A vast literature awaits you if you would retrace the path leading back to the beginning of intercommunication. You men of the cables and open wires who build the lines and keep them efficient for the flying speech of this modern day. Look in the record if you would know what went before the writing of your present manuals of technique. And you guardians of the amplifiers that help to make a whisper recognizable around the world. There's historic drama for you in the record of engineering and laboratory adventuring that gave you your tools of today. Deduct from the telephone art what a search of this record will disclose, and you have left, as you all know, nothing but the first crude instrument. The temptation to explore that record here is strong indeed, but there is time to pause at but a few of the pages that refer to this anniversary story. Our narrative is still in the early 90s. There were 300,000 telephones in the nation. From all important population centers, the lines were spreading to suburban areas. A system of long-distance lines was growing, but its limited range is revealed in a special directory of that day, a book listing all the telephones in America that were connected with this system by all metal circuits. It was called a national directory. Yet, the telephones it listed were in only 14 states, and 1,000 miles was still the limit for talking. But men were thinking, men were experimenting. And at the beginning of the century, there came to telephone engineers a device that would preserve weakened energy on long circuits. It was the loading coil. To understand the loading principle, we can think of energy being applied at one end of a rope. A wave pattern is created, but it soon disappears because of the rope's resistance. But if the rope is loaded with weights at proper intervals, the initial energy is not so quickly lost. Thus, the wave pattern is maintained for a longer distance. There was another development of the period that bears upon this anniversary resume. This was the possibility of arranging two circuits in such a way that a third circuit for conversation would be created. This third circuit is what you call a phantom circuit. The engineers who plan for these invisible carriers of speech know best the millions of miles of copper wire that the phantom principle has saved. As experience was gained in the scientific loading of circuits, hundreds of miles were added to the range of the spoken word. Historic advertisements told that an unlimited range was the hope, but limits still remained. And from the circuit map came the challenge of the gaps yet to be bridged, not just by wires, but by wires that would talk.
Excuse me. The door was open, so I walked in.
That's all right. Won't you sit down?
Thank you. I'm after some information about your service. I'm rather a large user. In fact, my firm uses several of your private wires.
You probably should talk with the commercial manager. I'm an engineer.
Well, that reminds me, sir. I talked with one of your engineers nearly 20 years ago. He said something about waves. Said you needed something that would make the long-distance wires talk farther.
He must have meant a repeating device or an amplifier. Something of that sort?
Oh, that was it. I'm glad you found it.
Oh, we've been developing repeaters for several years, but we haven't solved the problem by any means.
I thought you had. Why, down at the office, we often talk to St. Louis, Omaha. Service is pretty good, too. And now this statement by your president in the morning paper says we soon have service to the coast.
Oh, he doesn't say soon, does he? No. He just believes that universal service is on the way.
Well, I'm afraid I read it hastily. What is the difficulty? You say you have those repeater things.
Yes, but they've got to be better, much better. We're in a peculiar position. We know definitely what we need, and it doesn't even exist. That puts it right up to us, doesn't it?
I just can't grasp the problem.
The problem is to get the telephone waves to the distant end with volume enough, without distortion, and without picking up a lot of noise. Now, the lines we're using are loaded with...
Loaded? With what?
Well, loading in telephony is rather difficult to explain to the layman. But it means that coils of wire, like this, wound on iron cores, are introduced into the line every few miles. They don't add additional energy, but they do conserve what we have. They make the entire length of telephone line more efficient.
What are these thingamajigs you call repeaters?
They are also devices which are introduced into the line, but much farther apart than loading coils. They actually introduce new energy into the line to restore the electrical current when it becomes weakened.
Well, can't you use your coils and your repeaters together?
Now you've named one of the most tantalizing problems in our engineering. Here's the most important element in the repeaters we're using today. If we put a repeater employing one of these elements on a loaded circuit, the result is fairly good, up to a certain distance.
Well, if one of them helps, why not use a lot of them?
It can't be done. If we use more than one on a circuit, there's distortion and other troubles, too. There's no point in transmitting badly distorted speech, is there?
Then Denver is the limit from here.
It really is a little bit more than the limit. We aren't very proud of that circuit.
It's all very confusing. You've improved your line, still you need a repeater. Use a couple of repeaters, and right away you hurt your line. I never dreamed it was such a scientific matter.
Let me put it briefly. There are three considerations to this problem of getting your remarks in New York over a wire to, well, let us say San Francisco. First, the best possible amplifying devices. Second, the best possible lines made suitable for those devices. Third, the best possible circuit arrangements for combining the two. Now, I suppose that sounds pretty technical.
Yes, don't tell me any more. I'm mixed up enough already.
What I mean is, everything must be engineered to work together. When we get the amplifier we're after, we may have to make adjustments in the loading, or else the amplifier won't operate. The circuit arrangements may have to be changed. We don't know that yet. Every improvement affects everything we've got already. That's telephony.
Well, good luck to you. I hope you find what you're after.
We expect to do it. It's our job to do it. We have a splendid scientific organization. Some brilliant men have been assigned to this particular problem. We're not going to give up. When you hear that we have a line to the coast, a line that talks, you'll know that America has given something mighty important to the world.
It certainly will be important. Well, thank you, sir.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Just what was the job they wouldn't give up? It was the same as yours today, to get the message through. But the vital challenge then was to men of science, and the message was to be the first hello across the continent of North America. How that challenge was met, how telephone men from coast to coast teamed up to translate the accomplishment into an agency of service is one of the great chapters of telephone history. The details of the story are legion. They involve the activities of an army led by foresight and faith and inspired by a compelling sense of high purpose in an adventure of exciting significance. To the Western telephone organizations was to come a pioneering building assignment that demanded the utmost in enthusiasm, in skill and devotion. In the record is the name of every man who helped in that construction task. Every surveyor, teamster, cook, lineman, groundman, foreman, superintendent, engineer. And the men of the long lines at headquarters and along their circuits all the way to the Rockies had coordinating responsibilities of the most exacting character that call for equal devotion and skill. It was an army that moved. It was an army that achieved. Of its activities on a wide and changing front, there can be but the merest hint in this anniversary tribute.
Build that line to California. We'll make it work.
We must develop another type of repeater.
New York wants a report on our lines west of Denver.
New York's talking about a phantom group clear across the country. This Mercury arc repeater still seems too erratic.
Let's see what the labs can do with this vacuum tube.
We'll meet the Pacific men at the Nevada line. There's got to be a better vacuum. Start out the surveyors.
Put Transcontinental estimates in the budget.
Keep up the mathematical research. Rebuild and repair to Salt Lake. Then 130 miles west, all new. Present construction to the Reno area. Then 400 miles east, all new. Set up 3,500 miles of artificial line for testing. Make sure divisions 1, 4, and 5 are ready.
500 men can do it. Let's get organized.
We'll use 14,000 poles crossing Nevada.
This new tube design might work with better lines.
Remeasure loading and transposing. New York to Denver. It must be accurate.
The boss says 23,000 transpositions, including phantoms.
The temperature, still 130. Look out for rattlesnakes.
Some job, this loading. Every 8 miles across the country.
Repeaters ready for the first test?
All ready. 3 kinds.
Well, the job's about done, boys. There's the last pole.
Oh, those Americans can lay it on thick. This was on the Nevada-Utah border near a place called Wendover in January 1915. And this is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night transmission.
Today's telephone forces were in Bell System service on that January day of 1915 when greetings between East and West spanned 3,400 miles in dedication ceremonies. To these thousands, the developments of succeeding years must indeed make a story of vivid reminiscence. On that day, there was a single overland route, a so-called phantom group of 3 circuits only, a voice highway hailed as a miracle. And now there are 4 great modern communication arteries crossing the plains and scaling the western mountains, each with a multitude of channels along which may flow the words that bind together all sections of our country.
And this is 1940.
The amplifiers of the first transcontinental test are treasured as ancestors of nearly 500,000 that today give their restoring impulses to the currents coursing through them at 1,000 strategic centers. A frequency range of but 900 cycles represented the first speech that united East and West. Today, there is 3 times that pioneer range to bring about the clarity that distinguishes nationwide transmission. And 3 times 3 does not tell the extent to its special circuits. 50,000 miles of them can bring to radio stations the overtones of symphony and song. Storm-proof cables now span distances of unbelievable magnitude to the engineers of that first transcontinental highway. Direct circuits to faraway cities radiate from busy centers that switching may be minimized and the time gap shortened between your call please and ready with Atlanta. Antennas dot the coasts to take from the wires the voice of America and herd it to the telephones of 6 continents and to ships at sea, while others lift their alert and sensitive wires to catch the waves that hold the answering words. Truly today, Earth has no limit to human speech because of science and because of the men and women who guard and guide what science has revealed.
Someone will find out how to use it better. Something tells me. Something tells me.
And now a recording, the earliest recording made on the Transcontinental phone line, October 1915.
Mr. Edison, several hundred of your friends, including members of your family, associates of the early days of Menlo Park, heads of departments of your great organization, and all the members of your engineering staff are gathered in the library of your laboratory. This address, for instance, is being made to you by your greatest favorite, the Edison Diamond Disc Phonograph. An Edison granular carbon telephone transmitter is transforming the sound waves into electrical impulses, which, after following the tortuous paths of copper beneath rivers and bays, over valleys, deserts, plains, and mountains, are being reproduced in San Francisco as articulate speech. By the invention of your friend, Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, speech may now be transmitted all over the world. The personnel of the wonderful organization under Mr. Theodore N. Vail, head of the Bell system, and his illustrious chief engineer, Mr. Carty, have spent years of effort and millions of capital to reach the goal they have so recently accomplished. In the month of January 1915, they astonished the entire world by the establishment of through and excellent telephone service between the Atlantic and the Pacific shores of our great country, and only a few days ago transcended even this great achievement by the transmission of articulate speech by wireless telephone from the Atlantic coast across the continent and the Pacific Ocean to faraway Honolulu. We are indeed living in the day of miracles when from here we can converse with you, seated as you are in the booth of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company at the Panama-Pacific Exposition, 3,400 miles away.
And to bring us up to 11 o'clock, a short film on the laying of the first telephone cable across Bass Strait, 1936, from Apollo Bay to King Island and then to Tasmania. Submarine cable, 1936.
The story of communications by post, telegraph, telephone, and radio is a fascinating study of mechanical development. A story made possible by the vision of the engineer in the field and in the laboratory. Today, a hand lifts a telephone receiver while a finger twirls the dial of an automatic phone. In less time than it takes to tell, two people are in speech contact. Distance is eliminated. The handicaps of the past exist no more. Although as early as 1859, Tasmania was linked to the mainland of Australia by a cable laid across Bass Strait, this could be used only for telegraphic communication. With the laying of a new submarine cable, the Post Office achieved its ambition of linking by telephone all the states of the Commonwealth and making available to the people of Tasmania and King Island facilities which had long been enjoyed by residents in other parts of the Commonwealth. Many months of intensive research preceded the placing of the order for the necessary cable with Messrs. Siemens Brothers in England. 3 repeater stations were erected at Apollo Bay, King Island, and Perkins Bay, and equipment installed in readiness for the great adventure. This was to be the longest cable of its kind and the most modern in the world, and the eyes of all communication authorities, as well as the engineering world, were upon Australia as the task was commenced. The route followed runs from Apollo Bay, Victoria, to King Island, thence to Perkins Bay near Stanley, Tasmania. Land lines connect the cable to Melbourne and Hobart, respectively. Preliminary arrangements and the plotting of the course which the cable was to follow had earlier been made by skilled post office engineers. The Faraday arrived in Australian waters with more than 161 nautical miles of submarine cable carefully stowed in 4 circular tanks beneath her hatches, and was immediately taken to Apollo Bay. Here a close inspection was made of the spot at which the Victorian end of the cable was to be brought ashore. The ship then proceeded to King Island on a similar quest, while at Apollo Bay work at once commenced on the digging of a trench from the beach to the repeater station. In this trench, the shore end of the cable was to be laid. Installed in the repeater station is intricate equipment for the amplification of the current passing through the cable, so that it will reach its destination without loss of strength. The Faraday then returned to Apollo Bay, placing marker buoys at intervals of 5 miles to facilitate the laying of the cable on the return journey. These buoys are fitted with an ingenious timing device which lights a lamp at sunset and automatically switches it off at sunrise, and so warns shipping of their presence during the night. To land the shore ends of the cable and pull them to the repeater station, the ship's own hauling gear was used. 2 sand anchors were buried in the beach about 60 yards apart, and pulley blocks made fast to them. The sand anchor consisted of a heavy, flat wooden structure which was buried to a depth of about 4 feet. Chains fastened to the board were brought to the surface, and to these chains were attached the pulley blocks round which the hauling rope traveled. From the stern of the ship, a rope passed through the pulley blocks and thence to the winch on the bow. The cable was attached to the stern end, the winch operated, and slowly the cable was drawn ashore. Drums were affixed to the cable at intervals to float it ashore, thus keeping it off the seabed and reducing the strain. When sufficient length was ashore, these drums were cut off, and the cable sank to its allotted place on the bed of the ocean. With the Victorian end laid in the trench and connected in the repeater station, the anchor was weighed and the ship commenced laying the first section of the cable. Rolling to a long, steady swell, mile after mile of cable rippled steadily from the tanks to the blue depths of Bass Strait. History was being made, and the post office ideal of years was well underway. The cable, for technical reasons, was laid in 4 lengths. When approximately half the distance between Apollo Bay and King Island, constituting the northern section, had been laid, the cable end was buoyed. At King Island, the cable was floated ashore in a manner similar to that at Apollo Bay, and the ship then moved back over her route whilst laying the second length of the northern section. When the intermediate spot was reached, the 2 ends were joined and dropped in 50 fathoms of water. Then came the laying of the southern section from King Island to Perkins Bay. As the cable was laid, the strain to which it was being subjected was measured on a dynamometer. Engineers had previously calculated the point at which tension would become dangerous. After the 2 lengths forming the southern section were laid, the buoyed ends were brought aboard the Faraday, and the important work of making the final joint was carried out during the night in a heavy swell. The cable jointer is, of course, a specialist, as considerable care and long experience are necessary in the making of a joint which will for many years withstand the rigors of the seafloor. Although careful soundings are made to avoid deep sea valleys or precipices, the ocean's bed with its jagged rocks, marine growth, and all the rest of King Neptune's goods and chattels provides a formidable problem for the engineer. The slightest weakness in a joint, and the work of months may have to be done all over again. But everything went well, and the completed cable was dropped over the side of the vessel at 4 o'clock in the morning in 32 fathoms of water, and so was established telephonic communication between Tasmania and the mainland. Anxious engineers and perspiring men alike heaved a sigh of relief. Another job was done successfully. But there was something more. Another link had been forged in that chain of post office communications which binds together the people of the Commonwealth and provides an outlet to the rest of the civilized world. Let us now look closely at this modern cable. This sectionalized view shows its components. As we examine it, we see the protective wire armoring. Then the jute yarn, which forms a bed for the armoring. Here is the copper return conductor, which is covered by a metal tape which protects the conductors from marine borers. In the center is the single copper conductor with a diameter of slightly more than 1/8 of an inch. This is surrounded by an insulating layer of paragutta. The overall diameter of the cable, including the protective covering, is only 1.5 inches. This unique cable allows no fewer than 6 telephone and 7 high-speed telegraph channels and also 1 broadcast channel to be operated simultaneously. To the residents of Tasmania, more than 34 million telephone subscribers in practically every country of the world have been brought within reach. The vision of the past is the triumph of the present, made possible by the Post Office, Australia's national communications service.
And there we leave it, 86 years ago. 1936, the laying of the first telephone cable across Bass Strait. So you've been watching a selection of videos of the early history of the telephone, I suppose the beginnings of audio engineering in every respect, and the beginning of long line engineering, taking it from the first day of the first conversation over the first telephone. So with that done, we'll open it up on 147 475 for any calls. And this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. I notice that my current consumption is up by about 10% and my SWR is up by about 20%, so I don't know quite what's going on. Maybe water in cable. The cable and the antenna are about to be replaced. So, this is VK3AML, standing by on 147.475 megahertz for any calls.
VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu. VK3 Golf Lima Charlie.
Okay, we've got VK3ACZ. I'll just drag my level back a bit. It seems to have risen up a little bit for some reason. And we've got VK3 GLC Gary. So over to you first, Peter. I'm not sure. I think it may be, is it Monday night, the next meeting of the, or is it Friday night? I'm not quite sure. The next meeting of the Sherbrooke Radio Club. VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, Gary, and other listeners. This coming Monday night is club meeting night. I hope you'll be there. Can offer you a lift home. I've actually got something. I ordered a couple of small radios over the internet, and one arrived which ended up being surplus to requirements, so I might see if you'd be interested in taking it gratis, no charge involved, but I know more details about that now. Oh, I want to get started with tonight's broadcast. Chris, you're so industrious and you're so resourceful. I don't know where you find all this stuff. It's just superb. Tonight was a fantastic broadcast. As one who likes history nearly as much as you do, and be able to hear recordings from so far back. The first call, a little better than anything we have done before, he says. And you say soon after, bad acting indeed. Funny, I didn't mind the noise in the old recordings, anything around 1930. As a HFer, a rabid HFer, how could I complain about a little bit of snap, crackle and pop? Interesting thought that came to my mind with the Panama Exposition in January 1915, seeing the people there listening to their earpieces. I just wondered if something popped into my head like, your call is important to us, please hold the line. We have bad news about your computer. If you don't give us the password, you're infected with a virus. But no. The switchboard girls, some very attractive young ladies amongst them, but by goodness, didn't they look like battery hens, Chris? So many of them in such confined spaces. And I guess now that we're in the post-COVID or the current COVID era, the thought of being shoulder to shoulder with somebody like that really raises eyebrows. The 1915 recording of the first transcontinental message was kind of eerie in a way, but I guess my favourite of all of it, and only for personal reasons, would have to be the crossing of Bass Strait. I remember my grandfather worked for a salvage company, and one of the people who also worked with him was a fellow named Jack Johnson. In 30s, 40s, and that sort of era. And I remember that my grandfather telling me how Jack Johnson had walked across Bass Strait, checking the new cable that had come out, being an undersea diver. But anyway, thoroughly enjoyed the broadcast, as I'm sure everybody else would who was listening in. There's just something amazing about history. Seeing people that have not been with us for so long, and to see movement, hear voices, just magnificent. Thank you very much, Chris. Enough of the first over. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Leaving a pause in case any other breakers. I don't think there will be any. Just bring up my level a bit. Yeah, that Bass Strait cable, not the first Bass Strait cable. There, as I think the documentary said, the first cable was installed in 1859, only lasted, I think, a few months, replaced about 10 or 15 years later with a more permanent cable that gave good telegraphic communication across Bass Strait, rather slow telegraphic communication, but 1936, before there was actual telephonic communication across Bass Strait, and before that, the only way to get a signal from Tasmania to the mainland with speech was ham radio, radio telephone. We forget all of that now. Somewhere around here I have a photograph of the town of Burnie, northwest Tasmania on the coast, taken about 1930 or 31. And the town is just a forest of poles in people's backyards with antennas on them to catch radio from the mainland. Because in those days they really were cut off in terms of communication until that 1936 cable was landed at Stanley. Interestingly, in the 1980s I had a girlfriend for several years. We almost got married, but in the end I think she wanted to stay in Tasmania and there was no way I could make a career down there. But her people had a farm at Perkins Bay near Stanley, which was the old cable station, long gone, long sold off. But I've actually stayed in one of the residential buildings at that cable station in Stanley, on the far side of the peninsula that Stanley's built on from the town, the other side from the Nut, if you've ever been up that way. As for HF quality, well, the quality on phones, I understand, across the nation of USA in 1915 was such that there was 900 hertz of bandwidth. That means that you had something like 800 hertz to 1.7K, which meant that you would have had to repeat just about everything you said to get the message through. The articulation would have been very poor indeed, even compared to modern sideband, which is 2.7K wide. So with that, we go over to Gary, VK3GLC. Oh, thanks for the compliments on the material. I thought that it might be a little bit, Peter, I thought it might be a little bit far off normal ham radio stuff to get a big audience. That has proven to be the case. There aren't as many people listening tonight, but I'm sure that those that are interested particularly in telephonic communication, I know that there are a lot of old telecom techs that would be interested in all of that, and no doubt eventually they'll get round to seeing it. VK3GLC, Gary to take it. How's your week been, Gary, and how are things going with that motorcycle of yours? VK3GLC and the group VK3AML, with a pause for any other potential breakers.
VK3AML and group, well, Peter, at least, VK3GLC. Good evening all. Yeah, thanks for the material tonight, Chris. Of course, having a 30-odd year career in that particular field, across a wide range of technologies within that particular field, it was sort of pretty much close to the mark, I would say. Well, at least with me, anyway. Yeah, starting off in a small country station, well, a little bit north of Adelaide, but it was still classed as a country station. I was sort of fortunate to be able to experience, shall we say, some of the older style of technologies that were still around. So, you know, manual exchange, magneto manual, of course, with step-by-step and crossbar switching and various forms of long-line transmission and payphones and broadband radio, customer radio, broadcast lines, you name it. And a lot of the stuff was still around when I first started. So, technology hadn't quite caught up in the country fully. While most of it was automatic, there was still some legacy gear kicking around, and surprise, surprise, there's still a lot of legacy gear kicking around, which is why they tend to drag me back into the fold every couple of years to get them out of the proverbial, but pretty much the way it goes. Motorcycle is still sitting idle, has been for a couple of weeks. I've had a couple of trips out on it, but attention has been diverted to other activities, preparing for a few things that are likely to go on around here shortly, so I've been busy doing that, as well as the usual chores, you know, like cutting lawns and so on and so forth, but nothing super exciting, but plenty to keep me busy. Don't know how I ever had time to go to work. VK3AML and the group VK3GLC.
We had a blank carrier there. It's a little bit weak. Is anybody like to break in? No, just a blank carrier. Okay, Gary, 30 years in the field, eh? You must have seen some old stuff stashed away in country exchanges. I know that there is a parallel telephonic system in Victorian Railways, and years ago, in the 60s, I remember seeing at Camberwell Station, they had what was called an Adler-Burton French system handset that looked like something out of a Hercule Poirot episode. You know, one of those brass things with the black ebonite handle and a little funnel that came up to your mouth. very elegant but very, very old, and there was a completely independent telephone system running along most rail lines, completely independent of Telecom Australia, as I understand, the railway's own network. I think that's fallen into disuse now, but it'd be interesting to find out what's happened to all the gear. Fascinating stuff. You were out in the area north of Adelaide. I think you said Tarlee last week. It'll be interesting to hear from you next time we go round what you might have come across in the way of really old gear. I know that manual exchanges were primitive enough, but on Flinders Island, for example, because it was the sort of place it was hard to get rid of stuff from, a lot of material that even had been chucked out by radio and phone telecommunication services was still on the island. I know that their manual exchange is now in a little folk museum at Emitter up the north, up the western side of the island, about halfway up on Flinders Island. It'll be nice to see you on Monday, Peter. I hope to come along there, and I'll stick the video camera and stills camera under my arm just in case there's anything that's worthwhile, including, with permission of course, on next Saturday's issue of this. VK3ACZ, back to Peter for more comments. VK3AML.
Yeah, left a pause there, nothing heard. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. And Victorian Railways offered a telephone technician apprenticeship. I know because two young fellows from my school ended up doing their apprenticeship with them, and were quite happy that they did, because they said we wouldn't have got a reduction on our phone bill from working for Telecom or whatever, PMG as it was called in those days, but we got free rail travel by being a rail employee. Remember that fondly. And to think all that sort of stuff has gone now. Just quickly on the subject of Monday night's club meeting, I've been roped into doing a little presentation on QRP radio. Well, that'll be about 2.5 minutes of the whole night taken up, I'm sure. But Chris, just to divert for a moment or two from tonight's topic, I've had an absolutely wonderful week with not just DX but QRP DX so far. Sunday afternoon, 20 metres was carrying on like it normally did from about 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. The long path to Europe is going in absolutely gangbusters, and a non-resonant length of wet string will suffice as an antenna to get 5 9+ signals. And I thought, to give myself a bit of a challenge, I took my all-time favourite radio with me, my little 818 Yaesu, which is perhaps a little bit of a toy, a 6-watt radio. But started calling the DX, and to my surprise was getting good reports back, 5x5 from Italy, the same fellow Stefano that you spoke to when we were up in the same location. And yes, I was using the coax vertical half-wave antenna, the same one, but tuned into 5 watts. I say 5 watts because during the RD contest somebody went crook at me for calling myself QRP when I said I was running 6 watts. So, what an unforgivable sin that. But anyway, then I got a 4x4 from Sweden, and soon followed up by a 5x5 from Wales. I was very, very ecstatic about all that, and QRP is just not just the icing on the cake, but it's a big thrill compared to normal, even barefoot communications. And I followed that up just on Friday. Dave G4AKC in Bicycle Mobile in Blackpool, England, I was speaking with him, and he dropped his output power down to 1 watt, and he went from 5.9. I actually don't know what he was running at full signal, but when he dropped down to 1 watt, I could hear him 5x3. Very impressed with the whole thing. As I said, low power's the way to go, just for the sheer excitement, nostalgia value of it all. But anyway, enough of all that, enough of the boasting. It's been a great week for DX, as I said. Just getting back to your broadcast now, Chris, I had a couple of little freezes for a short while, buffering or whatever it was. I presume it was at my end. I'm just wondering if you noticed anything with your stream. Probably just at my end. But anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Pausing for breakers, nobody there. Yeah, nothing noticed here. I don't see any dropped frames recorded at all. I had a call from Mike VK7MJ, who lives south of Hobart, and occasionally he reports freeze frames, but it's probably congestion on the internet system. This being Saturday night, it's the sort of thing that you'd expect. I'm mostly concerned to get the recording of this up intact, and I've never yet seen freeze frames on the recording, which was, as I understand it, is made at the server end, wherever that might be. It might be America for all I know. I'm not quite sure where the servers are for YouTube live stream. I don't think they're in Australia because there's quite a delay on them. They're probably going over to California and coming back or something similar. But interesting what you're saying about low power. People forget that before the Second World War, all Australian amateur radio was limited to 25 watts of AM or CW. 25 watts was all we were allowed until after the Second World War. And they did, of course, amazing stuff, particularly with CW. 1923, Max Houghton, who I think was 3 Bravo Quebec, was, I think, the first Melbourne amateur to get through across the Pacific to California, and he wasn't using much more than 20 watts, a very unstable 20 watts, and probably a very inefficient antenna by modern standards. So QRP, really, to go for high power, and I've harped on this before, both RASA and the WIA are plumping for higher power above 400 watts, but the higher power they're plumping for is a kilowatt, and that's barely 3.5 dB improvement. I don't know whether people that are pushing for that know what 3.5 dB means, but on an ionospheric path that's fading up and down 20 dB, you couldn't even measure 3.5 dB. Some people have this macho thing of going for the biggest antenna, the maximum power, and I just, the motivation escapes me, I must admit. Sure, it's nice to squeeze every little bit out of DX, but given the choice of high power or better antenna, it's the antenna that wins hands down every time, because it works on receive as well as transmit. The 818 6 watts, I'll have to look it up. It sounds like it's a rather good little rig. I'd be interested to know what Dave G4AKC is using as an antenna on 20 metres on a push bike. The only thing I can imagine is that it's a single vertical helically wound antenna on a fiberglass core. Or maybe I'm making a mistake, maybe it's centre loaded with a very large inductor. Not sure. If you know what sort of antenna, I'd be interested in you filling us in. Meantime, around to Gary. The motorcycle's been idle, and I can understand why it's been idle with the absolutely dismal weather we've had, with the exception of only an occasional day here and there. It has been lousy weather for the last few weeks and depressing. Doesn't rain very much, doesn't sun very much, it's just dismal grey murk. I did notice actually when I lived in Hobart in Tasmania that even living in Hobart you get more sun there. It does rain a lot and it is a bit cooler, but the rain comes all in one pile and then the rest of the day is sunny, whereas here the cloud cover tends to hang. It's one thing I've got against Melbourne's weather. VK3GLC and group VK3AML. And about 11:30 we must think about doing Zoom as a trial. VK3GLC, VK3AML group.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, certainly a fairly comprehensive little presentation tonight. I think I may have seen one or two of those, or at least seen reference to one or two of those films. There's quite a lot on there. I've gone through a lot of the early switching stuff. Things are done in the States slightly differently to what we do them here, and it's interesting to see their terminology and how they put things together, but the whole principle of the thing is the same. But I'll say I've had the pleasure to work, as I said before, to work with a lot of the, not the very early stuff, but the stuff that was sort of prevalent in the 50s and 60s and thereabouts. It was still hanging around, and interesting to see those manual exchanges with the switchboard operators. Very, very interesting dynamics in those places, especially if you're a male. Certainly makes it. It was very interesting. That's probably all I can say about that. But replacing those cords on the cord circuits was not a job that I really enjoyed, only due to the age of the units. You fix one fault, you put 5 on, and then spend the next couple of hours fixing those faults. Not very pleasant, but all part of the process. And had the pleasure of retensioning open wire lines and sorting out cable loading and transposition. Very interesting stuff. It's all calculated in an engineering form, but certainly interesting when things go astray or people remove things that they're not supposed to remove. Makes it slightly interesting, but a device known as a TDR, which is quite popular today, in a more electronic form, useful way of checking lengths and line conditions over a twisted pair. I think I've still got a couple of TDRs sitting in my test equipment rack. Out in the other area, they get used every now and again for testing cables. Even coaxial cables are quite useful for. Something I was mentioned to Peter, yes, a little bit of DX on 10 metres the other day. Snagged a HS0 in Thailand. I think he's actually a VK2, but he lives there part of the year. So we did that, and I was also up at your DX spot yesterday, running the four-legged feral around, or one of them anyway, after his vet appointment to stretch the muscles out a bit. It was a little bit cool up there yesterday, but certainly gave him plenty of time to run around, that's for certain. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML, Group VK3GLC.
Have we got any other breakers? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, standing by.
VK3 Bravo Yankee Yankee.
VK3 BYY, VK3AML. Just hang on a sec, I'm just getting my date right here. Nice to hear you there again. Would you like to take it for an over? VK3 BYY, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3BYY. Yeah, very interesting. Took me back about 40 years to when I worked for Telecom for a while. and I think I saw some of that equipment. It's still in use at that time. I think down at Collingwood they still might have had a manual exchange part at Collingwood. They certainly had step-by-step switching equipment for the new automated telephones. Although by the time I got there we were installing the first of the electronic exchanges at Collingwood. So it was kind of interesting to have this equipment from the early 1900s right up to, what was it then, about 1970 something. Yeah, so really amazing. And yeah, the images of the Apollo Bay cable station were interesting. As a kid, I'd been in there a couple of times talking to the guys that manned it. I think carrying out an armful of those big old 1.5 volt zinc carbon batteries as well to drag home and build my own telephone system in the home. As far as the railways go, I think out this way at least, out in the Earthbridge line, they've replaced everything with optic fibre, pretty much, and also a digital radio system, I believe. But I think they still have their own telephone system. And I think they run the announcements on the platforms via them, via a telephone and a touch tone keypad, because you occasionally hear the touch tone come through as just before the voice announcements. And certainly you hear the person putting down the phone at the other end when they've made the announcement. So that's kind of interesting how that all works. Oh, and lastly, you mentioned YouTube. Yeah, well, YouTube all goes through Google data centres, and the nearest one to us is in Singapore, apparently, or China. So I suspect you'll probably be going to the nearest ones. Although I do know that Google also have data centres in Australia for certain organisations. While I was down at Monash Uni, they were basing all of their email systems and a lot of other things on Google, and the data centres had to be in Australia because they didn't want proprietary information and things going outside Australia, and there's all sorts of various laws and things that prevent you keeping things like medical records outside of Australia as well. So yeah, this could all be ending up in the data centre, at least in the reasonably close vicinity. Back to you, VK3AML, VK3 Better Boy.
Yeah, interesting point about it possibly being in China. I wonder how that's going to change with the passing of time. The Apollo Bay cable station's an interesting one. I know that the Telstra Museum, which was originally in a little building, I think, next to Richmond Rail Line in Swan Street, and now has moved to the Hawthorn Exchange, I think. But I have an idea that they have one of the major amplifier racks out of that 1936 Apollo Bay cable station, the first telephone communication across Bass Strait, actually on display there. At least I've seen it in the telecom collection back in the 1980s. I spent little over 12 months as assistant curator of electronics at the Museum of Victoria, 1984 and 1985, and during that time we liaised with the telecom historical collection, which in those days was stored at Down Street in Collingwood in an old warehouse. Staff of 2 from memory. One was a qualified museums person, the other one was a curatorial assistant. I've forgotten both their names, it is 37 years ago. But they had quite a good collection of material. But the Apollo Bay 19.5-inch rack intact was the largest piece of old equipment that I can remember. A lot of smaller, older stuff, including phones going back into the 19th century. So a nice collection has been put together by them. I hope it's been kept intact. Telecom Australia tends to be a little bit less concerned with the preservation of their history than with making a profit, understandably. But one hopes that they keep a sampling. Interesting that the trains have gone to optical fibre. That's the sort of thing I would expect. Actually, it's interesting with cable laying technology that we saw in that film from 1936. For a very long time, cables were semi-replaced, I suppose you'd say, by long-hop microwave links, including the hop that they used to have from Mount Oberon on Wilson's Promontory to Mount Tanner on Flinders Island, thence south, I think, to Waterhouse on the Tasmanian mainland, as you might call it. And now the whole idea of cable laying has been revived because it's better, broader bandwidth, less noise to lay a fibre optic cable under the sea. And of course it doesn't suffer from capacitive effects against the salt water. It's just a case of, I think they lay them with repeaters in the cable, optical repeaters. So that whole idea of cable ships and cable laying, which was in abeyance for almost 40 years, has returned with a vengeance, as I understand. Certainly a lot cheaper to lay a cable under the sea than it is to use satellite communication, or at least so I'm told by friends who work in long lines at Telstra. So back to Peter, who talked about the good aspects of joining the railway. Well, I've been alerted to the aspects, positive aspects of being involved with the Public Transport Corporation by Peter VK3AML, and whenever I travel on trains with him, he pulls out his gold card and pays nothing, or at least that was the case up to a few years ago. He may have now resigned from them and be living off the proceeds of some very judicious real estate investments that he's made through the years, and of course I think he's making something now from the sale of books, ham radio books, particularly on QRP, and they're very good reading too. Between Peter and Drew Diamond, 3XU, there's quite a bit of publishing going on of very good, readily built homebrew equipment, particularly for QRP. While we're talking about publications, something I draw people's attention to if you're watching the live stream particularly, is that RASA, the Radio Amateurs Society of Australia, at various hamfests are distributing these VK band plan laminated diagrams, which I've frequently found incredibly useful as a thing to stick on the wall here. And on the back they have a diagram of their QRM analysis and action plan, so-called QRM Guru, which to my mind, sounds like a very good idea in terms of raising attention to man-made interference problems and seeing some resolution to them. A concrete plan. So congratulations, RASA. That aspect of their publication has my full support. And I hope that a couple of their members, particularly one down in Gippsland, is watching tonight. Chris Chapman, hello. Round to you, Peter, VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3ACZ returning. And good evening to you, John. Good to hear you on. bit not concerned so much as puzzled that we haven't had Dave at ECG back. Surely he's back home from the old Dart, but missing him a little bit, being one of the regulars. Anyway, Gary, that was VK2BY you were speaking to, Brad over there in Thailand, HS0ZNR. Yes, I've spoken to him on 10, 15 and 20. Not this last trip, I've heard him, but the previous time or earlier in the year when he was over in Thailand. He's a good contact and he's quite happy to have a chat with VKs. Probably makes him a bit homesick. And Chris, the Yaesu FT818 that I mentioned is the more recent replacement of the 817, the 5-watt QRP radio. It's an all-band, all-mode radio. It's a lovely little bit of kit. People have good reasons for being disappointed with the 818 that it wasn't a vast improvement on the 817. In fact, it's not really worth upgrading according to what a lot of people say, but the 818's been with us since about 2018 or 2019 or something, and I love mine. And just quickly to answer your query, sorry I'm still off topic about tonight's broadcast, but G4AKC Dave, he's actually tricycle mobile. I've never stirred him up about that, but I did hear someone the other day teasing him about that. It's a three-wheeler, not a bicycle, but he's had over 2 million lookups on QRZ, so he's obviously a very active fellow there. I enjoy every contact I have with him. In fact, I think of all the G's, I would have worked him the most. He's on the edge of the water there at Blackpool. He has said the antenna, I know he runs a Kenwood most of the time. I'm pleased to see in his QRZ photos there's a little 817, 818 there as well. But he's often in company too with G4NVF, who has a quarter-wave vertical on the back of a disability scooter, I kid you not, and gets along portable about 10 miles up the road, he says, from Dave. On Friday when I had the contact with them, oh goodness, that's only yesterday, it seems like a week ago, another fella came up, G4ICP, who was backpack mobile, and you don't get a good look at what his antenna is either, but I presume it would be something loaded, but he was running 10 watts. And I gave him a 5x3. Now, he was in a place called Braintree on the other side of England from Blackpool, where Dave and Steve are. But again, I love these contacts with low power. I just think they're absolutely super. Sure, you've got to fluke the right conditions with the caudal hops and all that, I suppose. It won't work all the time, and it's not like you're going to be competitive in pile-ups. But goodness me, I was listening to a pile-up a couple of days ago, and it must have been more than a minute of stations giving their call sign. I couldn't even hear who it was that they were all actively seeking, but it was almost a joke. Just one after another call signs, and admittedly half the world's call signs came up. But my first thought is, why would you bother? So there you go, having a lot of fun with QRP. Sorry it's off topic with tonight's stuff, but I hope that answers the questions you posed in my last over. And I suppose if you're there on Monday night, you'll get to hear my little spiel about it. Anyway, back to you, Chris. All ready and set up if we're going to do the Zoom meeting. Be interesting to see if Rolly's around. Or perhaps Dave is still over in the old Dart. That'll be interesting. A VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, VK3ACZ and group VK3AML. We might try that. I'm not sure that I've got the right setup for this, but I'll just bring the camera to shoot a picture of the screen and get it close enough so that it's square on. Hang on, just screw that up. Okay, we've got a reasonable shot of the screen there. So now I'll see if I can launch Zoom. Where are we now? Microsoft Edge. I've lost the icon. Cannot see it. Oh, there we are. So we opened that. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima opening a Zoom meeting. hopefully. New meeting, start with video. And I don't seem to be getting any start. Ah, there we go. Now, bring that up a bit. Join with computer audio. Okay, let's see. I have a second pair of... is anybody coming up on Zoom? This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I can't see anybody joining us. I'm not quite sure how to give the details for this. Now, it's called Chris Long's Zoom meeting. The meeting ID number is 847 7749 1657, and the passcode is 0LV small k 0C. So if anybody wants to join, I'm not sure that I can copy a link across, but people should presumably be able to see all of that on the screen. Well, nothing yet. I might hand it round to Gary while we're waiting. VK3 GLC and group VK3AML.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Chris. I might make this my last over. I'm going to go and see what the two animals are up to. Must be something going on out in the backyard, so go and see what they're doing before I wander inside. Yeah, thanks very much for the broadcast tonight. As I said, all well received. And yeah, the Telecommunications Museum, at least in Victoria, is still at the Hawthorn Exchange, expertly curated by some ex-employees with a suitable amount of enthusiasm, and I believe they acquired some stuff that used to be in the South Australian Museum in the old training building in King William Street. It was put into storage when they sold that building off. All the relevant stuff came over here, and it's being either stored or displayed. So many and varied stuff. And people think that radio amateurs are a bit weird as far as our collections go and enthusiasm for old stuff. There's just as many people out there in the telephony sector that are doing a similar sort of thing. Part of a Facebook group of ex-employees, and there's a few of them out there with telephone exchanges in their sheds and PABXs hooked up to VoIP connections and goodness knows whatever else. So we're all out there. I've got a few microwave components from Surrey Hills that I haven't quite put together yet, and from time up on the mountain with the broadcast transmitters, I think there was more stuff going into the back of my truck than there was going in the skip bin when we were pulling the analogue television stuff apart. So I've got all that stuff to sort out at some stage, but it's all happening, and there's plenty of history still around. So anyway, I'll bid you all good evening. I'll drop it back to you, Chris, and catch you a little bit further down the track. VK3AML and group VK3 GLC.
VK3 GLC and group VK3AML. I've just put the ID and the passcode into the text column of the YouTube live stream, so anybody who cares to join us can presumably join us there. I haven't seen anything in the way of activity as yet, but there is a bit of a delay between the time I type up and, of course, the time it's seen. And I'm not sure whether I'm streaming audio into that stream either. We'll soon see. Lost in the technology. Participants 1. I might actually bail on that if I see nothing within about 5 minutes. Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. We'll catch up at some stage. I don't know whether you go to the Sherbrooke Radio Club meeting be on Monday night at... oh, there is somebody. Dennis O'Day. Hello, Dennis. Can you hear us from there? I'll just put my level up. And I'm seeing if I've got any audio from the stream. I don't think I have at the moment. People are talking, but I'm not hearing anything through. I'll try changing where I'm taking my audio from. Anything there? Ah, that's it. Hello.
Lost in the technology. Participants 1. I might actually bail on that if I see nothing within about 5 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. I don't know whether you go to the Sherbrooke Radio meeting.
We're getting a bit of feedback.
On Monday night at...
Can you hear me?
Hang on,
or am I low?
G'day, Chris. If you can hear me, I can hear you.
Ah, good. Dennis, is it coming through this?
I've turned you off the YouTube, so I've muted the YouTube.
Can you can hear me through the Zoom stream?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear you through Zoom.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Whereabouts?
we can hear you through Zoom.
Whereabouts are you, Tom?
I'm in Ballarat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Ballarat, yeah.
I've been meaning to get out there for quite a while. I have friends in Humphrey Street North that I usually stay with. And
all right.
Any idea? Any idea when their next Hamfest is going to be?
Yeah, the date is the 5th of February.
The 5th of February. That's next year.
Yeah, next year. The reason being the cost of locations skyrocketed. And what we've managed to do is across the road from the club rooms is a polo club.
Oh.
And we're hiring their building at the airport.
Right. What happened to the original buildings at the airport? I think there was some very old wooden buildings there.
Yeah, we're in what's left of the huts there. There's quite a few huts that various organisations have. The Model Railway, the Road Rodders, Darts Club, Pool Club. They all have all taken over buildings out there. The council's basically in a situation where they can't really demolish them, otherwise they get the heritage people on their wheel.
Gotcha. Yeah. And what about yourself, Dennis? What have you been up to?
My connection's unstable. So.
Yeah.
No. I've been quite busy with work, actually. I haven't had the pleasure of retiring yet, so I've been very busy at work and helping kids with university assignments. So I spent the day doing an international relations assignment for one of my sons.
Okay.
So I'd say so I've got a lot of kids which have got to cycle through university, so it's been quite busy. I really like the historical bits of your program. It's really good, particularly the Australian parts, because that doesn't get much airplay in Australian culture in terms of the historical artefacts from the step-by-step exchanges, the crossbar exchanges, the technology, OTC, what was OTC. None of that plays in any historical forum outside what Telstra used to have a small place many years ago.
Yeah, what makes it a little difficult is that the National Film and Sound Archive, having worked for the organisation, I know the tensions that go on there. There is an element, particularly at the shop floor, of people who want to see people using the material more. I was involved with video releases on VHS cassette of material relating to certain areas, like early Melbourne films, early Sydney films, that sort of thing. But there was another group within the archive who see the loss of control caused by wide public access to films being a problem. And so there's a tension there. And unfortunately, the stuff that they've got up on YouTube tends to be either material generated by Film Australia, the Commonwealth Government Film Unit, which is technically owned by all of us, or material of commercial origin where they're only putting up a small amount in the hope that they'll make a bit more money from the commercial sale of rights to films, I think. So it's a vexatious one. That particular one with, what do you call it, the Bass Strait cable appeared on, g'day TJ, by the way. That particular one with the Bass Strait cable turned up just out of the blue on a site that specialises on putting random 16mm prints of things up on the internet. It was slightly out of focus. It had a lot of hum. Fortunately, I could comb filter the hum, 100 hertz and the harmonics, and get rid of it almost completely. But there was a lot of defocusing too, so I had to put it into sharpening in Sony Vegas and really sharpen the crap out of it. I'm seeing myself back with about a 10-second delay on TJ's imager there. G'day, T.
Is there much with the National Archives? I notice when I do National Archives searches, they seem to have a lot of films identified.
I don't have a lot of experience with the Australian National Archives, the archives of the... they tend to be... Commonwealth archives tend to take a lot of stuff that's generated by government now. In that, I mean ABC radio programs, for example. But they've traditionally not been all that great on access. National Film and Sound Archive, there is at least some access, particularly on the net. And I'm heartened by the fact that they've put up a lot of Film Australia material. Particularly in the 40s, there was a lot of stuff done on telecommunication. And tonight I just wanted to get rid of the earliest material, up to 1936, because there's a lot of stuff from the 40s and 50s dealing with things like ship-to-shore radio, the installation of electronic switching and exchanges. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you'd pick up a phone back in the early 60s, you'd hear the sound of the clicking of a million uniselectors in the background. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. You don't hear that anymore. That's a bit of 1960s wallpaper, audio wallpaper that no longer anybody hears. Just recently I was transferring the audio from a 78 RPM disc recorded by landline from, I think, the Royal Albert Hall to HMV in something like 1929 when the first uniselectors were being put in. And the uniselector is almost as loud as the chorus in the record. It's just extraordinary. And you can imagine, because they're broadband clicks, getting rid of them is a real pain in the neck. You can't very well comb filter those. I see TJ, 3FTJS, has got his Wires X set up. I have a form of Wires X here, but I don't think it's the digital form. Are you hearing us, TJ?
I certainly am. You hearing me?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Yeah, that's just the FTM 400. That's the actual mode.
Okay. Is there much activity on it?
Not at the moment. No, it's very quiet. Hang on. I'll just fire it. Oh, I can't fire it up because I've got the camera plugged into the USB port.
Yeah. Okay. Do any of the rest of you use digital audio very much? Dennis or Tom?
No.
Yeah, I can't get into it myself because somehow to me it seems like paying a great deal extra for very, very poor audio compared to analog. I mean, at the moment I have the audio peak limiter here plugged through a couple of isolation transformers and going straight to the VCO. So there's virtually no frequency response limitation on the NBFM. So people who are listening off their discriminators can hear me with, I suppose, 8K of bandwidth or so. Hello, he's cleaning his screen. Yeah.
Well, it just gets so dusty being black radios.
Yeah, same thing here. I don't know where all the dust comes from. I mean, I think it must come fluff off the jumper or something.
Yeah, and this thing's touchscreen as well.
Yeah, well, touchscreens are notorious for it because, of course, they attract the fingerprints. But as I get older and my hands get drier, I find that I can't actually activate half the touchscreens that I'm given. It's a real pain. Hello, is he trying to operate? No, you can't operate your wires X, can you?
Yeah, because the modem's not plugged in.
Yeah. So, Dennis, you're in Canberra?
Yeah, no, I'm in Canberra. I've spent the whole duration in Canberra. I worked in New Zealand for 4 years, and I worked in the civil service there.
Yeah.
And in Sydney for 5 years.
Okay.
New Zealand was quite good. New Zealand was very good.
Actually,
so I worked as head of labour market.
If I was to emigrate anywhere, I think it'd be New Zealand. I've been very impressed with it on the several trips I've done over there. Which part of New Zealand did you live in?
I lived and worked in Wellington.
Wellington, okay.
In New Zealand, New Zealand is three clear cultures between Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland.
Okay.
And there's a real depth to the country. We don't have it here as much, but they have a real depth there in terms of you know people's historical perspective of things. Give you a good example.
Yeah.
The Americans had servicemen there in 1942, and they have an annual church service which they've been holding since 1942 to commemorate and thank the US for their time. And they are doing that. They're doing it 80 years after the event. You know, so incredible depth. I think their Radio New Zealand shortwave transmitters were originally American. They were left there after the war. They had them for 35 years. They replaced them, maybe a bit longer, and they replaced them in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's New Zealanders really make things, they make do with what they've got, and they're very good at it. And you can say, and the other thing about New Zealand, which I like, is there's a lot of retired Brits who went there. So when you retire from the UK, you go to New Zealand because your pension goes a long way, or your superannuation, or whatever you're on goes a long way. But real depth. It was a very different culture to Australia.
Yeah, well,
hard to believe, even though they're similar, but they're very different.
Very much noticed. I was very impressed that in most of the South Island, I've travelled far more than the North. I've only been once around the North Island. Though very impressed with, for example, the Museum of Transport and Technology in Auckland, which I think is the best working museum of its type that I've seen anywhere. It leaves Australians' museums for dead, even though the population to support it and the resources to support it are obviously less. The enthusiasm of volunteers there is just extraordinary. The other one, at the other end of the island, the Awarua Radio Museum between Invercargill and Bluff it just takes your breath away. It's in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand's outback. It's the equivalent of our ship-to-shore radio service that was, I think the station was opened in 1913, and they have it set up as really the most sophisticated radio museum I think I've seen anywhere. I believe
I saw your YouTube on that last year. It was very impressive, and there was a young guy who was running it well. anyone younger, anyone under 50 is a young guy now. But having been a bloke who's just gone on blood pressure medications this week for the first time, and I said to my friends, I said, "Are you on blood pressure medications?" Oh yeah, we're all on blood pressure medications. Yeah. But you know, the person who's running that museum in Invercargill, he was very impressive.
Yeah,
and he got right into it.
Yeah, he's on my Facebook list, and we're in fairly constant contact. His partner is the lady who's principally pushing the. She's kind of in charge of one of the people in charge of the local community radio station there, Southland Radio, which is the southernmost community radio station anywhere in Australasia. I think they're effectively about 300 miles south of Hobart. So really...
They are.
Yeah.
They are. So latitude, Christchurch is further south than Hobart. So the Americans run all their Antarctica stuff from there.
Yeah.
So, but the thing about New Zealanders is when they get into an interest, they get into it a really big way. Where Australians were a bit more superficial about our interests, but they get into it in really, really deeply and get really connected to it.
Yeah.
And the radio station is a good example down there.
Yeah. Well, I was particularly impressed with what I saw in Christchurch. We were welcomed by Murray Healy, ZL. I can't remember, ZL3 something. Murray will kill me when he hears me say that. I know that he watches these live streams occasionally, and he got together the boys from the Christchurch local amateur radio group within NZART. We had a meet and greet dinner almost as soon as we got there. Very nice people. And then Mike, who had done his PhD, Mike 7MJ, VK3AML, who had done his PhD at the University of Otago, and I lobbed into a meeting of the NZART group at Dunedin, where of course the University of Otago is based. And we were welcomed like long-lost brothers. I couldn't believe the depth of welcome. The next day we were invited to 2 radio shacks. I should say shacks. I slipped into New Zealandese. A shack. And ZL4RMF, I think, was one. ZL4LV was the other, up on Saddle Hill, either side of Saddle Hill, both with very impressive setups. And then, of course, in Invercargill, the young chap who showed us around the Ararua Radio Museum is ZL4OM, and he's interested in pushing that museum to have a big amateur radio component. I suggested at the time we were there, actually, that really it would be an ideal spot for a web-based software-defined receiver, because they're in very noise-free conditions. They're in a unique location with sub-Antarctic reach, and not affected by tropical thunderstorms at all. So that'd be a good one. But whether they have the funding for it's another thing.
Yeah, no, it's very hard for them to get money. Money for community activities is very difficult. Here, it's a bit easier.
Yeah.
It's much easier to find grants and things like that here. Over there, it's much harder. It's much harder. Yeah. Much more deeper pockets over there. New Zealand essentially went through 3 crises. So I was head of labour market over there, so I was a senior public servant. New Zealand, with the Brits joining the common market in 1972, it took all the wealth out of the country. It's an agricultural country. To the election of the Longi government, they reformed the labour market. They dropped all the tariffs and import quotas, and the country was badly in debt in the mid-80s. So there's a period of time where New Zealanders really suffered. It was probably from about 1980 to about 1995. And you can see a real mark on the country with that. There's 2 New Zealands. There's a pre-1980 New Zealand and there's a post-2000 New Zealand.
Okay.
And they're like different places. And you can see that those people who are above 50, they grew up in a pre-1980s New Zealand, and those who are below about 35 grew up in the New Zealand. So in Australia, we've had gradual change.
Yep.
Since post-World War II migration. In New Zealand, it was all of a sudden done in a real hurry, and everything changed overnight. And you can really see it in the culture.
Yeah, I think Mike was saying that they had a period where they were really close to bankruptcy.
Oh, absolutely.
And he was fortunate to get out of his PhD course at the end of the 70s, so he didn't really have to experience very much of it. But had he stayed on, he would have wanted to have stayed on, because he keeps telling me that he likes the empathic nature of the local culture. People feel for each other over there. I don't know how else to put it, except that standing in the main street of Hokitika or Greymouth, which God knows is kind of the end of the world, you open up a map and 2 or 3 people will walk up to you and say, "Hey buddy, would you like us to sort you out in terms of directions?" Here you would have to ask somebody across a shop counter. Over there, they volunteer it. There's a certain sensitivity that I noticed over there. I mean, even in a place like Rotorua, where the Maoris look big and threatening, they're actually, because they are so physically big, frequently they don't ever have to be aggressive with it. So big, gentle people was what I found. I might have had an unusual experience, I don't know, but if I was 30 years younger, I'd be very tempted to go over and try it as a place to live.
Same with me. I mean, I went over there. I enjoyed it. I loved the place. They were very well travelled. And you're right, New Zealand is very empathic, and they're genuinely interested in other people. Whereas in bigger cities, you can really feel it in a city. People are just too busy.
Yeah.
They're too busy getting from A to B, and I wouldn't say they don't care, but they're just not interested. There's no connection. In New Zealand, it was kind of different, because you could strike up a conversation with anyone over there. And the only reason why I didn't move there is I had young kids, and there was no future for them in New Zealand. To get your first connection over there was very difficult. When I was over there, everything was word of mouth. It was like Wellington was like a great big country town. And the depth of relationships went back half a century. And you could see it on the staff of Radio New Zealand. There are lots of guys, and there's still plenty of people there who'd started in the 1960s. And they were still there 40 and 50 years. I remember talking to one fella. I said, "Why do they keep you?" And he said, "Well, I know where all the skeletons are." Basically, he says, and he'd been with them for 50 years.
You mean, fire me, and I'll let everybody know who your mistresses have been for the last 20 years.
Exactly. But the thing is because they had such a depth, they knew where everything was. It wasn't a superficial engagement. It was probably like the ABC used to be like in Melbourne, with when they were in Broadcast House. You had that sort of thing. It was more of a family rather than just an employer. You had that culture, and you can see it with the ABC Social Association in Melbourne. You have a depth of relationships which go back to the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, I was involved with the ABC in program making about 1978, 79, 80, 81, and at that time it was morphing from the old commission into the new corporation, with all that implied. There was a change of the location of the control. From ABC-FM went to Adelaide, I think in a purposeful attempt at getting rid of some of the Sydney-centric aspects of ABC. Because one of the things that always griped me in ABC radio talks and documentaries, then called special projects, was that everything had to be approved. Every move in every program had to be approved by head office in Sydney, and that, from a Melbourneite's point of view, is a pain in the neck and a few places further south.
Well, the mistake they made in Sydney is they centred everything in Ultimo. So it's spread across 8 sites in the city: William Street, Elizabeth Street, Gore Hill. And when they centred in Ultimo, it just turned it into turned it too much corporate.
Yeah.
They've now moved them out to the western suburbs, out to Parramatta, so that may change the culture a bit. But I always thought with the ABC, it would be good if none of the offices had more than 20% of the staff, and they just moved them across the country again.
Yeah.
And had big regional centres.
How did NZBC compare?
NZBC were on a shoestring. They were very good. They were very, very, very good. Programs were on a shoestring. They took a lot of programs, a lot of the British style programs, but they New Zealandised it. The Saturday night program, which I still listen to, apart from listening to this, is very good. There's a guy called Peter Fry who ran it, and he was a bobby cop in London, and then he joined Radio New Zealand in 1966, and he stayed with them for almost 50 years.
Gosh.
And he retired. He was pushing 80 when he went, and but he was very good. He had a depth of music, and he ran a club called the 78 Club, and had all these 78 records. And he'd just been playing all of this sort of stuff. It was great, and they had a very big following. The guy who runs it now, he's a bit younger. He's about 70. He's a radio there in Australia, but he's very good. But the depth of knowledge, because these people, when they get an interest, they really get an interest, and they live for the interest. Peter Fry lived for the interest of his 78s, the Scratchies Club they called it, and he had his program, and you could see that across the whole NBC.
Yeah.
So they have a religious music hour at midnight. A woman called Robin Jackery runs it, and she's got a depth in terms of religious music in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And knows the music, knows the composers, knows the stories behind it.
Yeah, yeah. I used to have contact with the New Zealand NZBC archives, which I think were in Timaru, of all places.
Yeah, they were, yep.
I don't know quite why they put them there, and I remember the archivist in the mid-80s, whose name just escapes me. He used to wear tweed a lot. Good-looking young chap, I can't remember his name. But he was saying, I said, how are you enjoying Timaru? Because he's a fairly cosmopolitan sort of bloke, and he says, surviving. So I think he felt a bit kept out on a limb. Timaru's kind of, how could you describe it in Australian terms? It's hard to find an Australian equivalent because there is so much distance, unpopulated distance between centres there, unlike here where there'd be, towns every 10 kilometres. If you go, for example, from Christchurch to Queenstown, there are not many real big sources of population along the way. It's really wide open spaces.
Well, it really thins out on the South Island. The further south you go, the thinner it gets. I mean, I think the South Island's about 1.2, 1.5 million, and it's bigger of the two islands. Everybody's on the north. Interesting you say that. They had a historical radio program on Radio New Zealand, and there was a guy, I can't remember his name. He was started off as an announcer in Timaru. Actually, let me go back one step. The oral archivist with New Zealand Archives, he'd been with them for 40 or 50 years too. And he was quite well known in New Zealand, and very interesting character, because when you've been in an organisation for 40, 50 years and you've driven things there, you know where everything is.
Yeah. I at one stage came across some acetates recorded by the NZBC. How they got into a private collection in Baronia, here in Melbourne, I have no idea. But they were a series of recordings of the arrival in Wellington of Gracie Fields, of all people, on a tour of New Zealand about 1946 or 7. And the other thing I remember was that archivist was fascinated at the National Library where I was working when I met him, 1981, was that somehow the National Library had retained 16-inch transcription discs of the opening of 2YA, which I think was as far back as 1936. So there's quite a bit of cross-pollination across the pond.
There was another fellow I met over there. He's an interesting guy. He was about 95, and this is in 2012, and he was a junior technician in Christchurch at the commencement of the war.
Whoa!
And he said I was on shift when the war happened, and he was quite a successful businessman afterwards. But he started off as a junior technician. You know, there's an incredible depth because things don't move that fast over there. It's a so there's a real depth of family relationships. In New Zealanders also, when they go overseas, they usually come back. So if they do a 30-year career or a 40-year career in Australia, they'll head back home.
Yeah, I've just noticed we've got 10 minutes left on Zoom.
Sorry, guys, I've been talking too long.
That's okay. That's absolutely fine, Tom. We don't have that much time to talk on this. I'm looking into JITSI, JITSI, which is an open source equivalent of this, but I'm not so familiar with it. So I'm going to have to do some practice shots with it to find out. So, Tom, what's going on in Ballarat? Anything particular that you'd like to bring up with the radio club or whatever?
Not really. We're sort of pushing around the date for the Hamvention was only decided the last couple of weeks. We had to get back to the Polo Club, and they had to give us some dates that didn't clash with them. And then we had to sort of make sure we didn't clash with any other Hamventions and things. So the 5th of February come up. The hassle was the previous place we used at the Greyhound had doubled their price.
Oh, okay.
Doubled the cost. And in fact, we actually make as much money, if not more, at a Bunnings sausage sizzle than we do at the Hamvention.
Right.
And we've had two Bunnings sausage sizzles this year.
Oh, right.
With a name for another one. The last sausage sizzle we had, we pulled in $1,500.
Good heavens! Whereabouts was that? In Ballarat.
In Ballarat, they call Delacombe. We've got two Bunnings.
Yeah.
One in the centre of Ballarat, another one they built out at Delacombe to cover the chippies that are building the thousands of houses out this way.
Okay. Delacombe is out. Is it north of Lake Wendouree, sort of north?
No, it's down south near. It's like an extension of Sebastopol.
All right. Okay.
All right, and it goes west. Now I'm in Winter Valley, which is north of Delacombe, which is expanding west from Ballarat.
Right. Right.
If you know, it's a Carnham Road or Greenhalls Road. They used to be going through paddocks and farms.
Yeah.
They don't anymore. You've got houses either side of the street. And the poor old council's having troubles keeping up with road.
So that's extending out beyond the old Anzac Arch, or whatever they call the Arch of
That's
Victory.
right, yeah, exactly, yes. Extends well past that. And in fact, where they wanted to put the original ring road in, the houses have built out to that area.
Okay.
And they've had to do major restructure, like the bypass that goes around to the north.
Yeah.
That was originally supposed to be a ring road. Well, traffic just wouldn't let it happen.
Yeah.
They're now extending further around, but the amount of traffic that's on the road through buildings, through trucks and everything else is just wearing the roads out.
Yeah.
Just down the road from us, they're going to turn a T-intersection into a roundabout, and that's going to be out of mayhem for 6 months.
Yeah.
Because it's going to have to deal with builders and dump trucks, and we've got two concrete cement manufacturers just up the road, and in the morning that road up and down is busy with mixers.
Gosh.
And that's when they pour us first thing in the morning.
Yeah. Most of my communication with your lot is via the Buninyong repeater, which I get at about 20 over 9 here. Gets in very well to the high spots in the eastern suburbs, which is where I am.
Yeah, they've taken the diplexes out for a single antenna. They're now running them as a 2 antenna system.
Ah, okay.
So they're still in there, but it's running through 2 instead of actually going into 1.
Yeah.
And also the Wyson repeater hangs off that as well.
Yeah.
But that's not used. It's sitting there plugged in.
Is it on the same tower that pedestrian lookout is? There's a platform of
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That's right up there. the guys did a bit of work about 4 or 5 months ago because we were having some noise troubles.
Okay.
And the minute they got it out to 2 antennas and did a bit of work up there, a lot of the noise problems disappeared.
Oh, great.
Which made it really, really good. And possibly we're having some antenna hassles as well, so going over to 2 antennas is probably a good idea.
Yes, yes.
But other than that, no, we still have our Thursday morning coffee mornings.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind for when I come up there next. Yeah.
Every Thursday, yeah, and we have usually 2 Friday night meals a month. One of the guys organises those at one of the local pubs, mainly just for a get-together, get the husbands and wives out. Our Thursday morning coffee is all us old fogies get out there and discuss our, a few of us have got artificial knees, quite a few have got hearing aids, type 2 diabetes, a couple of us, not me, but a couple of them have got the heart pacemaker thingamajigs in there, and so you get to have a talk about all sorts of weird and wonderful things. We work out that we solve the world's problems in a morning over a cup of coffee.
Tom, are you retired?
I'm semi. I work 3 days a week, which is great.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I'm 65, and I've worked for the boss I've worked for now nearly 12 years. And when things started to slow down, he said, would you mind going on 3 days a week? And I'll put you on casual rates. And this was when I was also due for a long service leave. So we clicked all that in. So for 12 months there, I was actually earning more than I did if I worked a straight 5-day week. But no, I'm flexible with him. He can give me a call Friday night to say I want you in Monday morning, or things like that. So I could work any time during Monday to Friday.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean by that aging business. I had to. It just sounds like a chore, but I organised a get-together for my grade 6 primary class of 1965. We were a very coherent lot, and we managed to get 17 of them together at a local pub. We're all 68 now, and the first girl I had a crush on turned up, and it was like, in many ways, it was like we picked up the conversation 60 years later that we'd last had. But gosh, some of them were limping along. My first girlfriend was all hunched over. None of them wheeled themselves in, not yet anyway.
No, not yet. Our group mainly is, we do get some of the young, so when you say younger ones, you say mid-30s, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Come in, but of course they're usually working of a day, work day time. But most of the guys, Craig, KG comes in all the way from Cape Clear, and we've had a couple of visitors come through that were in town at the time.
I hear Lockie occasionally.
Yes, he comes up quite a bit. We had our AGM the other weekend and sorted all that out. So we were losing our president and our secretary, and we were lucky enough to have someone stand up for both of those, which was good.
Right.
So our AGM went actually quite well. Rather trying to find people to take places. And at the same time, we didn't have to put up a vote, which was good. Everybody was happy with the position they looked at. Yeah.
I see we've got 2 minutes left, so we better have final comments from everybody. First of all, yourself, Tom.
Well, I'll leave you all to it, and I'll just mute out.
Okay. All the best, Tom. Look, catch you on...
Great evening again, Chris.
Thanks. I hope we catch you on the Buninyong repeater soon. And any final comments, Dennis?
No, I'm good. It was a really interesting night tonight. I'll send you the... I hope the FM stuff was useful the other day I sent you.
The FM stuff. FM. I'm just trying to think. Oh, yes. The early experimental FM. Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know the exact dates for that, so that all helped.
Yes. So that all started in 1947. It was recommended during the war, so it was interesting. So they set up in essentially 4 sites around us, Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and they're running 4 kilowatts in each of the sites.
Yeah.
So it was quite interesting. They did it for about 10 plus years.
Yeah, 4 kilowatts is a very considerable amount on 2 metres too. But not on the same band we use now, as I understand.
Yeah, I think it was 93 megahertz.
I'm not sure. Anyway, 1 minute. We've got 1 minute. Any final comments, TJ, before we go back to the radio?
No, all good, mate. All good. I'm just listening.
Okay, TJ.
Usual, mate. Usual, sitting on the fence like a sloth.
Okay. It looks like we've got zoomed down to a fine art, except that I have to point a webcam at the screen. I can't scrape the screen on the second computer and take it back to the mixer. So I'm not quite sure how to do a better job of that. The audio's no problem. I can mix that in with no problem. So, you know, you're being recorded on the other live streaming, but the quality of the picture is limited by the screen to webcam patch, unfortunately. Anyway, less than a minute. We're about to pop off at any stage. So at that stage, I'll go back to the RF link. Thanks very much for popping up, Dennis, and thank you, Tom.
Catch.
Oh, gone. Hang on. Hang on, folks. We'll go back to the way it was. And so we take the webcam off there, put it on its usual posi. Hang on. Sorry about the wobbles. This is called ultra unprofessional. Unprofessional. But then, of course, there's no pretense at that, and I'm running whoops, come on. It's on a difficult spot. I can switch this lamp off now. That's to give a bit of frontal lighting for the webcam on the other computer. That's better. Okay. We've got all our lighting on, and I'll bring up the dates. There we go, and we're back to normal. So, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, back to 147,475. Is anybody still there? Are you there, for instance, Mark, VK3BYY, VK3AML?
ACZ is.
Well, take it, Peter. It sounds like we've lost Gary and Mark. Better start winding up. It's 12:30, but very successful on the Zoom, I think. VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, it was for you and the others. VK3AML, VK3ACZ returning. I wrote down the pass code wrong, obviously. I had Oscar, Lima, Victor, small kilo, 0, Charlie, and it didn't work. So I tried every combination of lowercase, uppercase. I spent almost the whole Zoom meeting listening, but trying to crack the code. So you can let me know how I wrote it down wrong. But a big fail. Now, I don't get anything, that site information you have on the screen where you said the address had been plastered. I don't get that on my phone. I had Greg ND try to show me how to, or how he did it on his phone or what it looked like, but I just can't get that other information. So I was stuck. I was hoping you'd drop the transmission on 147475 so I could call in and get the correct passcode, but not to worry. Anyway, it was all right to listen to, and next time I'll make sure I copy down the code properly. But anyway, another wonderful broadcast tonight. I was surprised to hear you say that numbers were slightly down. I would have thought that was right up the alleyway of most amateur radio operators, because one, it involved communication, and two, its history, and I find it hard to believe that there are people who aren't interested in history, but there you go. Obviously people are. Thanks for what you do, as always. I will look forward to catching up with you on Monday night, and without actually saying what the radio I've got that's surplus to requirements, but the fact that I'm prepared to give it away if you want it should indicate something about the brand of it. I believe you took one of those to Deal Island. Would you be, if you've not got one, because I recall at the time you'd borrowed that one, if you've not got one, would you be interested, VK3AML, VK3ACZ?
They're always handy if you're in a remote spot and you're with a group and you want to keep in touch with the group, that's mostly what we used it for. We just spoke across the island among ourselves on those, and we all had one or something very similar. Yeah, it'd be handy, and I've certainly got the batteries for them for obvious reasons, but the way mine failed was that between the main body of the radio and the battery on the back, there were little gold pins that are spring-loaded. And on mine, the spring loading ceased. So the battery wouldn't connect properly, or if it did, if you gave the radio a knock, it would stop. That's what I mean by built to a price, not to a quality. Back to you, Peter.
Yeah, we're on the same page. Yeah. Anyway, all right. Well, I'll bring it along on Monday night. As I said, it's free to a good home. It's surplus to requirements, and to tell you the truth, I got a bit silly. I had to have one particular brand, one particular model of the brand came out in 5 different colours, and I had to have the 5 colours. Not that they work any better. And obviously, I've not put them on the scope. I've heard people say that they're dirty as, and other people say, no, they fit in okay. I just noticed that the front end's pretty awful for filtering, but again, you get what you pay for. But anyway, I will bid you my farewells for tonight. Oh, can you just come back again, just to put me out of my misery? Can you tell me, what, if you've still got it there, what the passcode was for tonight's Zoom? Over.
Well, I think your problem was that they weren't OLVK, small k, OC, they were 0LVK, 0C, and that always is a trap. VK3 ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, that's funny, because in all my various combinations I did try the O as a 0 to start with, but I thought I did absolutely every combination, but not to worry. Anyway, again, I will go QRT now. 20 metres is open. I noticed there's a contest on this weekend. I don't know what it's all. I think it's an Asia contest, because there are a lot of JAs on this afternoon on 15, and I exchanged numbers with them. They want your actual physical age, 5, 9, and the numbers of your age. There's a fellow in Oman at the moment coming through rather nicely, so I might see if I can pick him up if the QR Mary will allow. But anyway, otherwise, till we meet again on Monday night or whenever, I will bid you a fond farewell and just say thanks once more for what was a marvellous historical broadcast full of interest and fun. Cheers, and 7-3 Chris, VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, cheers. Cheers, Peter, and probably see you Monday night. I can't see anything to stop me. I'll let you know if I can't. Couple of final things. First of all, thanks to Tom and Dennis and to TJ Terry for popping up on Zoom. Thanks for making that successful. I hope the thing that will make it easier in future, number one, with no time limitation, number two, without the palaver of passcode IDs and all that crap. I believe that Jitsi, once it's set up, is a lot simpler to get into. So, it's up to me to get Jitsi going, which I hope to do. And to the people on the text chat, thank you for coming up. Ardran, John Young, Terry, FTJS, Dennis, of course, Pirate, whoever you might be. I still haven't worked that out. I know who Pirate VK is, but I don't know who the other one is. I suspect it might be our friend in Glenroy. Let's see who else has been on there. VK Pirate. So good. There was something I was meaning to mention, Peter, and I can't think what it was. Oh yes, there has just been a series of news releases by New Zealand newspapers, the New Zealand Herald particularly this week, about Baofangs. They've become a banned import in New Zealand, and they claim that they're causing interference with essential services. I find that very difficult to believe, unless they're a specific type of Baofeng that's preset to those frequencies. I can't imagine that they would be, but some administrations are very sensitive about them. And the gist of the New Zealand article was that a large shipment of them, something like 50, had been confiscated from the importer for destruction. Anyway, thank you to all the people, both online and on radio, and on Zoom, of course, for your support. Almost always very appreciated. And I'm glad that at least with some people the slightly off-topic telephone stuff was of interest. I think you'd find, the average person here would find the telephone material from a later period, the 1940s through to the present, probably more relevant to the radio side of things, because radio was integrated with the system by that time, whereas in all of those early reports it was all hard-wired wire line connection with very few exceptions. Anyway, with that, all the best on 147.475. I'll take a final listen. VK3AML listening. Nobody else? Okay. So we fade down all of the channels except the mic. And thank you to the people watching on the stream. I hope the stream will be of some permanent value as a reference point for people interested in the early aspects, the aspects of very early history of the telephone. Some of those clips that I used that did sound very noisy, in their original uploads were close to unwatchable, not only fuzzy, but with so much noise and so much diminution of high frequencies that they were virtually unintelligible in the soundtrack and difficult to look at in the visuals. So I hope I at least brought them up to a passable standard. Thanks for that comment, John. The telephone stuff was excellent. Well, I hope it was passable. That's about all. I notice Adrian says Google has lots of servers close to the users. It costs too much to transfer data from a handful of data centres to each user. So it may be somewhere in Australia that it's all stored. I've often thought, YouTube, the sheer amount of memory required for all of those YouTube channels and all of those clips, even mine, particularly those in 4K, is mind-blowing. They must have a massive supercomputer with super memory stashing away somewhere. And John Young, you saw a brief freeze frame of maybe half a second at the beginning. I'll have to check the recorded upstream, perhaps tomorrow when I feel a little bit less, if you'll pardon the expression, buggered. But the last of that telephone material that I was editing and rendering, finished rendering at about 5 o'clock this afternoon, so it was a bit touch and go. And then a lot of the commentary that I added to it had to be done off the cuff, on the run, just playing back sequences of stills and hoping my timing with the narration was okay. Occasionally I'd crash into the soundtracks, but this is not a paid job. I wish it was. But it seems that the only way to get pay from YouTube is to be about 18 years old, a girl with enormous norks, exposing them, and that way you get huge amounts of hits for very little effort. However, at 68, my norks are slightly bigger than they used to be, but I don't think they're saleable as yet. And with that, rather than going any further along that line, I'll wish everybody a very good evening, and hopefully we'll see you next Saturday night, 9:30 p.m. That is 11:30 UTC, unless I'm mistaken, for the next episode. Not sure what I'll do next week. It may be just more modern material related to telephonic communication and telecoms. So, that being said, all the best to everyone, particularly those in New Zealand. Love you, New Zealand.